The morning light in Mainz arrives through the high narrow windows of the bindery with a quiet, patient slowness. You step over the threshold from the cobbled lane and the first thing that meets you is the smell. A warm, quiet mixture of old hide glue, paper that has rested in stacks for years, fine wood shavings from the carpenter's plane, and a faint metallic tang from the iron lying press that stands like a sleeping animal near the far wall. The room is not large, but everything in it has its own familiar place, settled by long habit. The long workbench runs along one side beneath the windows, its oak surface darkened by the oils of countless hands. On it, your tools wait just as you left them the evening before. You close the door behind you, and the sound is a soft wooden thud that settles into stillness. Your apron hangs on a peg by the door, a length of heavy linen stained with old paste and the grey marks of handling metal. You take it down, slip the loop over your head, and tie the straps behind your back with a slow, practiced motion. The fabric settles against your chest, a familiar weight. The hearth is cold, because the spring morning is warm enough to work without a fire, but a small brazier glows near the wall to keep the glue pot at a gentle heat. You walk past it and feel the faint warmth brush your left arm. You move to the stone basin that sits on a low shelf near the door, pour water from a glazed jug, and rinse your hands. The water is cool and clean, and you let it run over your knuckles and palms before drying them on a scrap of rough linen. This is how every day begins here. The door, the apron, the water, the pause. You do not rush, because the work that waits for you does not demand speed. It demands only patience and the habit of careful hands. Now you stand in the center of the room and let your eyes travel over the space. The high windows are set into the thick wall, their leaded panes slightly wavy, so the light that falls through them is soft and slightly diffused, as if it has passed through a thin layer of water. Outside, the city of Mainz is beginning to wake. You can hear the low murmur of cartwheels on the stones, the call of a vendor somewhere in the next street, and the occasional flapping of a pigeon's wings against the eaves. But these sounds are far away, absorbed by the thick walls and by the quiet that lives inside the bindery like a permanent tenant. Your attention comes to rest on the stacks of printed sheets that are arranged in neat piles on the long side table. These sheets came from the press of the master printer who died not long ago. His name still lingers in the corners of the workshop, spoken softly by the few who remember the sound of his steps on these floorboards. The sheets are not new, they were printed some years ago, one pull at a time, the black letter type biting into damp handmade paper. Now they belong to his heirs, who continue the work without any display of hurry or grief. The book you are to bind is a copy of the Great Bible, the large folio volume with its 2 columns of dense text and its 42 lines to the page, the same Bible that the master printer spent so many years preparing. The sheets have been stored carefully, flat and dry, waiting for hands like yours to gather them into gatherings, sew them onto cords, and give them the protection of wooden boards and leather. You walk over to the side table and let your fingers rest lightly on the top sheet of the first pile. The paper has a slight tooth to it, a surface that is neither smooth nor rough, but somewhere in between, with a pleasant drag that a fingertip can feel. It is a warm cream color, not white, because the linen rags from which the paper was made were never bleached to an artificial brightness. You lift one sheet carefully, holding it by the edges, and tilt it slightly toward the light. The printed text appears as a dense black grid, the letters sharp and upright, with small variations where the ink lay a little heavier or lighter on the paper. This is the artifact of the press, the slight irregularity that makes each sheet individual, even though the words are identical. You place the sheet back down and pat the stack even with the side of your hand, a small gesture that has become second nature. The workshop around you carries on in its stillness. A small spider has made a web in the corner of the window frame, and the threads catch the light. The brazier makes no sound except a faint ticking as the charcoal settles. The lying press rests in the corner with its great wooden screw turned loose, its cheeks open just a finger's width apart. Next to it, the sewing frame stands upright on its solid base, its 2 oak posts and the horizontal crossbar creating a simple rectangular structure. The frame is old, well used, the wood polished smooth where hands have tightened the pegs and tied the cords. 3 lengths of unbleached linen cord hang loosely from the crossbar at the moment, waiting to be adjusted later when the sewing begins. You will not touch the frame yet. That work belongs to a later part of the day, after the gatherings are made. You pull out your stool, a low three-legged seat, with the top worn into a gentle dip, and sit down at the workbench. The height of the bench is set so that your forearms rest comfortably on the surface when you lean forward. You take a moment to arrange a few small things near you. The pot of cold paste, its surface skinned over from yesterday, a bone folder that lies in a shallow groove worn into the wood, a small clay dish containing a curved sewing needle, its eye just large enough for a waxed thread, and a roll of linen thread the color of undyed wool. The brass lamp on the bench is not lit because the morning light is sufficient, but it stands there as a reminder of the darker hours of winter. You reach for the first sheet of the first gathering. This gathering, the beginning of the book, will eventually hold the opening lines of the great text, but right now it is only a stack of 5 large folio sheets that must be nested one inside the other. You begin by taking up one sheet and laying it flat on the bench before you. The sheet is folded once in the middle, forming 2 leaves, 4 pages. You run the edge of your palm along the central crease, not to sharpen the fold, but simply to settle the paper fibers into their natural resting position. The movement is slow and gentle, almost a smoothing gesture, and the paper responds by lying flatter than before. You then drape this first folded sheet over your left forearm and let it rest there while you reach for the next. Your hands move in a calm, unthinking rhythm, the kind of rhythm that comes from having performed the same task many hundreds of times before. You take the second sheet, fold it in the same way, and nest it inside the first, tucking the folded edge snugly into the inner curve. Then the third, the fourth, and finally the 5th sheet, each one slipped inside the growing stack. The paper rustles softly, a dry whisper that is the loudest sound in the room. When all 5 are together, you lift the whole gathering with both hands and place it flat on the bench. You pat the spine edge and the foredge with small nudges of your thumb, aligning the leaves so that no single sheet protrudes beyond its neighbors. The gathering now lies as a compact unit, 10 leaves, 20 pages, waiting to be joined to others. You set this first finished gathering under a light pressing board, a smooth plank of beechwood cut slightly larger than the page size. On top of the board you place a smooth river stone, a weight you found long ago on a walk outside the city walls. Its surface cool and grey. The weight holds the gathering flat while you work on the next. You then turn back to the piles of sheets and begin again. Pick up a sheet, settle the fold, lay it over your arm, take the next, nest them, align the edges, stack under the board. The repetition is not dull, it is steady, like the turning of a water wheel, and your mind can drift or settle without losing the thread of the action. The morning light shifts almost imperceptibly across the bench. A patch of sunlight that fell on the far edge of the table has now crept a little closer to your hands. You notice it without looking directly, the way one notices a change in the temperature of the air. The bird sounds that had been scattered earlier have now coalesced into a more constant chatter from the rooftops. Somewhere a church bell rings, the single note of St. Martin's, and then fades. You do not count the gatherings as you form them, because the process itself is the measure. The stack of sheets on the side table gradually decreases, while the pile under the pressing board grows taller. After a time, you pause to clean the bone folder with a scrap of linen. The folder is a simple tool, a flat piece of bone about the length of your hand, rounded at one end and pointed at the other, smoothed by use until it gleams dully. You wipe it down, not because it is dirty, but because the small ritual of cleaning your tools is part of the calm that settles over the workshop. The paste pot sits nearby, and you check the glue on the brazier, lifting the lid of the small iron pot and stirring the warm contents with a wooden spatula. The glue has the consistency of thin honey, a pale amber color, and the steam that rises has a sweet, slightly animal scent. You replace the lid and return to your stool. By the time the stack of uncollected sheets has grown small, the sun has reached the middle of its slow arc behind the high windows. The light now falls in broad dusty shafts that make the floating particles in the air visible, each one a tiny speck drifting with no apparent purpose. You take up the last sheet, fold it, nest it, and add the final gathering to the board. Then you lift the stone weight, remove the board, and examine the stack of gatherings you have made. There will be many more days like this, many more piles of sheets to gather into quires. But for now, the first part of the work is complete. You place the gatherings in a sturdy box lined with felt, a container that will keep them clean and flat until the sewing frame is ready. Then you wipe the bench with a dry cloth, brushing away the faint dust of paper fibers that has settled during the morning. You rise from the stool and stretch your arms slowly, feeling the gentle pull in your shoulders. The door of the workshop remains closed, but through the window you can see a thin ribbon of cloud moving across the pale sky. It is a day much like the day before and much like the day that will come after. Nothing in the bindery has altered beyond the slow accumulation of finished gatherings, and even that change is so gradual as to be almost imperceptible. You walk to the window and look out for a moment onto the lane below, where a woman is passing with a bundle of kindling on her back and a small dog trots at her heels. Then you turn away and let your gaze rest once more on the wooden sewing frame that stands in its corner, silent and ready. The frame's upright posts are darkened with age, with small cracks that follow the grain, but it is still stout and true. The 3 linen cords droop slightly, tied loosely to the pegs, and you know that when the time comes, you will wax your thread, adjust the crossbar, and begin the long, slow process of sewing the gatherings onto those cords. But that time is not yet. This morning was for gathering, for the simple act of assembling the quires one folded sheet at a time. The afternoon will bring its own quiet tasks, perhaps a check of the boards, a sharpening of the chisel, a rubbing of the leather with a damp cloth. For now, the workshop simply holds its peace, and you with it. You dip your hands once more into the basin, letting the water close over your wrists. The coolness is a small refreshment. You dry your hands, hang your apron back on its peg, and take one last look around the room. Everything is as it should be, the tools are lined, the paste covered, the fresh gatherings resting in the felt-lined box. The daylight continues to pour through the windows, unchanged in quality, patient as the bookbinder. The quiet of the bindery is not emptiness, but a presence, a stillness that has accumulated over years and will accumulate over many more. You step toward the door, and the floorboards creak once under your foot. A single note. Then you push the door open, step out into the lane, and pull it shut behind you, leaving the workshop to its patient, sunlit silence. The following morning you return to the bindery, and the first thing you do is uncover the stacks of printed sheets that have rested overnight under a linen cloth. The sheets are exactly as you left them, pale and patient. Their edges are lined in neat towers that cast sharp shadows in the early light. The room is cool but not cold, and the smell of old paper and dry glue welcomes you like a familiar piece of clothing. You wash your hands, tie in your apron, and pull the stool close to the side table where the piles await. Today the work is simple. You will gather the quires, one after another, until all the sheets are nested into the units that will later be sewn. You take a moment to study the first stack. Each sheet is a large folio, printed on both sides with the dense black-letter columns of the Bible text, and each one has been folded once down the middle to form 2 leaves. The fold is soft, not sharp, because the paper was never creased with a bone folder. After coming off the press, it merely settled into its shape over years of lying flat. You lift the top sheet with both hands, holding it by the foredge and the tail, and carry it to the workbench. There you lay it open, the fold facing upward, and run the heel of your palm along the inside of the crease with one slow, even stroke. The paper yields a little, the fibers relaxing under the warmth of your hand, and the 2 halves lie flatter than before. You then fold the sheet closed again and drape it over your left forearm, letting it rest there while you reach for the next. The second sheet is lifted from the pile and brought over with the same gentle care. You open it, smooth the inner fold in the same way, and then nest it inside the first sheet, slipping the folded edge down into the center until it rests evenly. The paper makes a soft, rustling sound, similar to dry leaves stirred by a breeze, and then it is still. You glance at the edges to see that the head, foredge, and tail of both sheets align, then give a small nudge with your thumb where one corner stands slightly proud. The 2 sheets now form the beginning of a gathering, thin and tentative. You reach for the third. The stack on the side table diminishes by small degrees, sheet by sheet, as you transfer them to your arm. You fall into a rhythm that is not mechanical but steady, a rhythm born of familiarity, and your mind can wander without disturbing your hands. The third sheet is nested inside the second, and then the fourth inside the third, and at last the fifth completes the choir. The 5 double sheets, now gathered together, make a single unit of 10 leaves, 20 pages. You lift the whole gathering from your forearm, cradle it in your palms, and carry it to a clear space on the bench where you pat all 4 edges into alignment with light, percussive taps of your fingers. The gathering becomes a compact block, the spine edge straight, the foredge a gentle curve, ready to be pressed flat and stored. You place this first finished gathering under a light beechwood board and set the smooth grey river stone on top of it. The weight keeps the paper from cockling while you work on the next. Then you turn back to the piles of sheets and begin again. A fresh stack, a fresh sheet, the smoothing stroke, the nesting, the nudging, the pressing. The movements repeat with small variations. Sometimes a sheet is slightly wider and requires a firmer pat. Sometimes the inner fold is stubborn and you run your thumb along it twice, but the essential pattern remains unchanged for a long, quiet stretch of the morning. The light through the high windows moves in increments as the sun arcs behind the rooftops. The beams that fall across the bench shift from grey-white to a pale gold, and the dust motes suspended in them dance with the slow movement of the air. A piece of paper drifts from the stack and flutters to the floor. You stoop to pick it up without breaking your rhythm, blow a speck of dust from its surface, and return it to the pile. Outside, the street is waking more fully now. You hear the regular creak of a water cart, the distant clang of a smithy, and the intermittent call of a man selling fresh eggs. But these sounds come as if through a curtain, muffled and irrelevant. Inside the bindery, the only sounds are your own breathing, the rustle of paper, the soft clop of the stone weight, and the occasional scrape of the stool's legs on the floorboards. You work through the stack of sheets that will form the gospel gatherings, then the psalms, then the epistles. The piles are labelled with small slips of scrap paper in a handwriting that is not your own, perhaps the master printer's, or one of his assistants, each bearing a brief note like Matt, 1 Den, or Rom, 1/8 in a faded ink. You remember the order of the choirs without having to consult any list. The structure of the Bible is a map you learned long ago. Each choir will be 8 leaves, 10 leaves, sometimes 12, depending on the printer's plan, but you handle them all with the same unhurried patience. The gathering of choirs is not a task that rewards speed. It rewards attention, the quiet awareness of paper fiber and grain direction, of moisture in the air, of the minute differences between one sheet and its neighbor. As the morning deepens, you pause to flex your fingers, which have grown slightly stiff from holding the sheets. You pour a cup of water from the jug, drink it slowly, and look around the room. The spider in the corner of the window has enlarged its web, adding a subtle spiral of new silk that catches the light. The glue pot on the brazier bubbles with a low, continuous sound, its contents unchanged. The sewing frame still stands in the corner, patient, and now its cords lie untied across the crossbar. Everything is in its place, and the quiet of the workshop feels like a deep pond into which no stone has been dropped. You set the cup aside and return to your stool. The second half of the morning brings a subtle change in the air. The temperature rises a little, and with it comes a faint increase in the smell of the glue, which takes on a slightly sweeter note. You notice that the paper seems a fraction more pliable as you handle it, the fibers relaxing further in the warmth. You adjust your pressure accordingly, smoothing the folds with a lighter hand so that no crease becomes too sharp. Your body knows these adjustments without your mind having to direct them. The years of practice have laid down grooves of habit that run deeper than conscious thought. Your eyes scan each sheet as you pick it up, not reading the text but merely checking for gross flaws, a torn corner, a smear of printer's ink, a watermark that is too dark. Most sheets are clean, and you pass them onto your forearm with a quiet approval. One by one, the gatherings accumulate under the pressing board. You remove the stone from time to time, lift the board and add a fresh choir to the stack, then replace the weight. The stack grows in millimeter increments, a slow thickening that is almost invisible from moment to moment, but undeniable when you look back after an hour. The edges of the gatherings form a stratified block, a geology of paper layers, each stratum a section of scripture. You rest your hand on the top of the stack and feel the slight coolness of the compressed air trapped between the leaves. It is a satisfying coolness, the physical evidence of work accomplished. At the far end of the bench, you have placed a felt-lined tray for the gatherings that will not fit under the pressing board. When the main stack reaches a certain height, perhaps 6 or 7 quires, you transfer them carefully to the tray, keeping them in order, and cover them with a second square of felt to protect them from light and dust. Then the pressing board is empty again, and you begin a new stack. The process has a natural rhythm of accumulation and dispersal, like a slow tide. The church bells ring again, marking the mid-morning hour, and you look up briefly to watch a band of cloud cross the window. The bells are a familiar voice, so deeply woven into the fabric of the day that you rarely notice them unless you choose to. Today you notice, and then you let the sound fade back into the general hush of the workshop. A pigeon lands on the windowsill, grey and blue, and turns its head to peer into the room. You meet its round orange eye for a moment, then return to the sheet in your hand. The pigeon remains for a while, its feathers ruffled by the breeze, and then departs with a whir of wings. The dust motes swirl in the empty space where it stood. Now you come to a pile of sheets that is slightly different from the others. These are the pages that contain the canon tables, the Eusebian apparatus that arranges the Gospels into parallel columns, and the layout is more intricate. The type is smaller here, the columns narrower, and the red rubrication that will be added later by an illuminator is already indicated by small letters printed in the margins. You handle these sheets with an extra degree of care because the multiple columns mean the fold must be placed exactly along the gutter between the second and third columns. You take a small square of graphite and mark the correct fold line on the top sheet of each stack, a faint line that only you can see, and then fold according to those guides. The gatherings that emerge have a slightly different thickness, but they nest just as neatly as the others, and you add them to the pile with the quiet pride of a craftsperson who knows the value of small precision. The morning wears on. The sunlight now falls at a steeper angle, illuminating the grain of the oak tabletop in vivid relief. The shadows under the tools lengthen and blur. You have finished perhaps 2/3 of the sheets, and your pile of completed gatherings is a substantial block, while the remaining stacks of uncollected sheets have dwindled to a few low towers. You pause to wipe your hands on your apron and to take another drink of water. The water is no longer cool, having absorbed the room's warmth, but it is still refreshing. You roll your shoulders once, and the bones give a tiny, satisfying crack. The repetitive nature of the work encourages a particular state of mind, one that is neither wakeful nor drowsy, but suspended somewhere in between. Your thoughts drift over small domestic matters, the bread you will eat at midday, the state of the leather strap on your shoe, the sound of rain if it should come later in the week. These thoughts come and go, like clouds, leaving no mark. Your hands continue their dance. Pick up, smooth, nest, align, press. The paper slides against paper, the folds accumulate, the gathering grows. A sense of deep calm settles over you, a calm that is not imposed, but gently invited by the slow cadence of the work. By the time the last sheet is folded and nested, the sun has nearly reached its zenith, and the light through the windows is a clear, steady white. You stand up from the stool, place the final gathering onto the tray with its companions, and cover them all with a clean linen cloth. The tray is heavy now, full of 40 or more gatherings, and you carry it with both hands to the shelf where it will remain until the sewing frame is ready. You slide it into place next to a stack of oak boards and a roll of alum-tawed calfskin, items that will be needed later. Then you return to the workbench and spend a few minutes tidying. You pick up loose scraps of paper from the floor, wipe the graphite dust from the bench, and set the tools back into their accustomed positions. The bone folder goes into its groove, the needle rests in its clay dish, the paste pot is covered with a piece of slate, the stone weight is placed on the corner of the table, and the pressing board leans against the wall. Finally, you take the unused sheets that were set aside as spares or due to slight imperfections, and you stack them neatly on the bottom shelf. They will serve as waste sheets for testing paste consistency or protecting the work from glue. Nothing is thrown away. Paper is too precious for that. Then you stand still in the center of the room and let the silence flood back in. The street noises have subsided. Perhaps the city is resting in the midday lull. Even the birds have fallen quiet. The only sound is the faint tick of the cooling brazier and the distant, muffled voice of a child somewhere far away. You feel a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion that is not triumphant but simply complete, like a circle closing. The gatherings are ready. The quires lie in their tray, each one a small universe of folded paper, waiting for the thread that will bind them together into a single body. The rest of the day will be given to other small tasks, but for now, you allow yourself to sit for a moment on the stool, hands resting on your thighs, and simply breathe the air of the bindery, which smells of paper and paste and old dry wood, the most restful scent you know. The morning's labor has passed like a long, slow exhalation, and the afternoon spreads out before you, empty and calm. The sewing frame has waited in the corner of the bindery, silent and still, a patient piece of furniture whose purpose is to hold paper and cord in alignment while you join them with thread. Today, you turn your full attention to it. You walk across the room and your footsteps are soft on the old floorboards, the sound absorbed by the wood and the quiet air. The frame is built of oak, darkened by age and polished by the repeated touch of hands. Its base is a heavy rectangular plank, wide enough to support the largest gatherings without wobbling, and from this base rise two upright posts, square in section, with a series of small holes drilled through their inner faces. A horizontal crossbar, rounded and smooth, spans the distance between the posts, its ends fitted into the holes and secured by simple wooden pegs. You can raise or lower this crossbar by moving the pegs to different holes, an adjustment that allows you to sew books of varying thicknesses. Today the bar sits at its mid-position, which is where it has sat for many months, because the Bibles you bind are all of a similar size. You run your hand along the top of the crossbar, feeling the grain of the wood, the slight undulations that years of use have worn into the surface. The bar is slightly warm to the touch, as if it has absorbed the morning light. From the bar, 3 lengths of unbleached linen cord hang down, tied loosely to the crossbar at one end and dangling free at the other. These cords are the sewing supports, the bands that will pass along the spine of the book block and later lace into the wooden boards. They are made from long staple flax, spun and twisted into a strong, slightly fuzzy cord about the thickness of a goose quill. You reach up and untie each one from the crossbar, then lay them straight on the bench for inspection. The cords are clean, free of knots or weak spots, and you run your thumb along their length to check for any unevenness. Satisfied, you set them aside for now. The base of the sewing frame has a bed, a flat area between the upright posts where the gatherings will rest during sewing. On this bed you see 3 small notches cut into the wood, aligned with the cords that will hang down from the crossbar. These notches guide the cords and hold them at the correct spacing. You kneel down and blow gently into the notches, dislodging a few grains of dust that have settled there, and then wipe the entire bed with a dry cloth until it is smooth and clean. The frame is ready to be set up. You tie the upper ends of the 3 cords back onto the crossbar, using a simple slip knot that can be undone easily. The knot sits snug against the bar, not too tight, and you leave the cords hanging straight down. Then you stretch each cord down to the bed of the frame and pass its lower end through the corresponding notch, pulling it taut and securing it temporarily with a half hitch around a small wooden cleat on the underside of the base. The cords now run vertically, parallel to each other, evenly spaced along the length of the crossbar and the bed. You step back and squint at the setup, checking the alignment with one eye closed. The center cord is exactly midway between the outer 2, and all 3 hang without any twist or slant. You adjust the left cord a fraction, nudging it with your fingertip until it runs true, and then you are satisfied. The spacing of these cords is not arbitrary. They correspond to the positions of the sewing stations you marked on the spine of the first gathering some days ago when you prepared the quires. The marks are 3 faint vertical lines drawn with a graphite point, faint as a whisper, dividing the spine into 4 equal panels. The 3 cords will sit exactly on these lines, and the sewing thread will loop around them, pulling the gathering snug against the supports. You retrieve the first gathering from its felt-lined tray, open it gently to its center, and hold it up to the frame to verify the alignment. The graphite marks line up perfectly with the cords, and you allow yourself a small internal nod of confirmation before returning the gathering to its resting place. Now you turn to the thread. On the shelf above the workbench sits a wooden spool wound with fine linen thread, undyed and slightly glossy from the natural wax in the flax. You pull off a length about the span of your outstretched arms, then another, until you have 3 good lengths. You take a lump of pure beeswax from a small linen bag, a piece the size of a walnut, pale gold and fragrant. Holding the first thread taut between your hands, you draw it slowly across the wax, once, twice, 3 times, until it picks up a thin, even coating. The friction of the thread against the wax produces a soft, steady sound, like a gentle exhalation, and the thread darkens slightly as it absorbs the wax. You then pull the thread through a fold of clean linen to remove any excess, leaving it smooth and supple but no longer slick. The wax will help the thread glide through the paper without tearing and will lock the stitches in place once they are tied. You repeat this with the other 2 lengths, then lay them across the bench, side by side, like 3 pale lines on the dark wood. The needle you will use is a curved one, a bookbinder's needle, its arc shallow and gentle. It is made of steel, dark grey with a faint patina, and its eye is elongated, just large enough to accept the waxed thread. You hold the needle up to the light and thread it, pinching the end of the thread flat and guiding it through the eye with a single, practiced motion. You draw the thread through until the 2 ends are equal, then pass both ends together through the wax one more time, uniting them and giving the needle a double strand that will be strong enough to hold the heavy gatherings. You set the threaded needle down amidst clay dish, and the dish catches the light, a small shallow bowl of earthenware with a greenish glaze. The frame, the cords, the thread and the needle are now all assembled, and the morning has crept forward by half an hour or more while you worked. The light in the room has shifted, becoming slightly brighter and sharper around the edges, and the temperature has risen just enough that you feel comfortable without sleeves. You pour a little water from the jug into the basin and dip your fingers, drying them on your apron, a pause that allows your mind to catch up with your hands. The sewing frame stands before you, its cords as tight as harp strings, but silent, and the furze gathering waits in its tray. Before you begin to sew, you check the small details that make the difference between a well-bound book and one that will pull apart with time. You examine the kettle stations, the points near the head and tail of the gathering where the sewing will enter and exit. These stations are not marked on the paper, you simply know them by feel, a distance of about a finger's width from the end of the spine. You make a tiny pinch in the fold of the outermost sheet at each kettle station, a tactile guide that your needle will find later. Then you place the gathering back onto the bed of the sewing frame, open it to its exact center, and slide the cords through the small openings you made earlier at the graphite marks. The cords pass between the pages and lie flush against the inner fold, each one resting in its station. The gathering sits squarely on the bed, its spine pressed against the upright bed of the frame, and the cords travel vertically up to the crossbar without any deflection. Everything is aligned. You reach for the threaded needle and hold it between your thumb and forefinger, the curve of the needle fitting naturally into your grip. For a long moment you simply sit there, the needle poised, the gathering open, the cords taut. The workshop holds its breath. The brazier ticks quietly. The dust motes hang suspended in the shaft of light. The world outside the street, the city, the entire river valley of the Rhine seems to recede to a distant murmur, a hum barely perceptible at the edge of hearing. Inside the room, there is only the frame, and the paper, and the thread. The first stitch will enter from the outside of the fold at the right-hand kettle station, the one near the tail of the book. You bring the needle up to the paper, the tip just touching the tiny pinch you made, and you push it through with a slow, steady pressure. The needle pierces the paper cleanly, and you feel the slight resistance of the fibers parting. You draw the thread through until a short tail remains outside, about the length of your little finger, and then you pass the needle back out from the inside, bringing it over the nearest cord. The needle goes over the top of the cord, then down behind it, and back through the same hole from which it just emerged, forming a small loop that encircles the cord. You pull the thread snug, and the cord is captured against the spine. This is the first link, the beginning of the chain that will hold the whole book together. Your movements are small and unhurried. You work your way along the gathering, moving from right to left, over the first cord, through the paper, out at the center of the gathering, over the second cord, through again, over the third cord, and finally out at the left-hand kettle station. Each stitch is identical to the one before it, yet each feels subtly different because the paper is not perfectly uniform and the cord shifts ever so slightly under the tension of the thread. You pause after the third cord to check that the gathering is still square on the bed, then continue to the final exit. At the left kettle station, you make a small chain stitch by passing the needle through the loop that formed when you entered, locking the thread so that it will not pull back through the hole. You pull it tight, but not so tight that the paper tears, and then you snip the thread with the small scissors that hang from a hook on the side of the frame, leaving a clean tail about the length of a fingertip. The first gathering is sewn. You place it aside on a felt-lined tray and pick up the second gathering. The process repeats, step by careful step. You open the gathering, align it on the bed, pass the cords through the stations, and begin the stitch. The needle enters at the right kettle, travels over cord, over cord, over cord, and exits at the left kettle, where the chain stitch links it to the tail of the previous gathering. The thread bridges the gap between the gatherings, forming a small, neat ladder of stitches along the spine, each rung a gathering, each side rail a kettle stitch. The rhythm of the sewing becomes a kind of meditation, a slow, cyclic pattern of needle in and thread through and pull snug. Your breathing steadies and deepens, and your heartbeat slows to match the cadence of your hands. The smell of the beeswax on the thread mingles with the smells of paper and glue, a sweet, clean note that rises from the work. You pause occasionally to re-wax the thread if it begins to feel dry, drawing it once more across the block of wax, and the needle regains its smooth glide. The cords, meanwhile, remain steadfast, never moving, never loosening, their pale fibers soaking up the faintest trace of wax from the thread. You notice a small speck of wax has fallen onto the bed of the frame, and you flick it away with your fingernail, then continue sewing. The morning passes in this way, gathering after gathering being added to the text block. The stack of sewn gatherings on the felt tray grows thicker, the spine taking on a slight curve as the swelling builds. This swelling is natural. The thread passing through the folds adds a tiny amount of thickness, and over many gatherings this accumulates into a gentle rounding of the spine. You do not fight it, but welcome it, because a flat spine will later be rounded with the hammer, and the natural swell helps the process. You check the tension of the cords from time to time, plucking one with your finger like a lute string. It produces a low, resonant note that fades quickly. The knots on the crossbar and the cleats remain tight, and no adjustment is needed. Your hands begin to know the gatherings individually, even though they are all nearly identical. Some are slightly fatter because the paper was pressed less firmly, others have a tiny tear near a corner that you avoid when handling. The sewing adapts to these small variations without you having to think about it. The needle finds the kettle holes by feel, guided by the minute indentations left from the pricked openings in previous gatherings. The thread runs through the paper with a soft hiss, and the loops over the cords tighten with a faint creak. There is a harmony in these sounds, a quiet music that only a binder would ever hear. At a certain point, you stop to count the gatherings you have sewn. You do not need to count them for any practical reason. The book will be complete when all the gatherings are attached. But the small discipline of numbering them gives the work a quiet structure. You count 12. Which means you were roughly 1/3 of the way through the sewing for this volume. You make a mental note and then let it go, returning to the rhythm of the stitch. The frame remains as steady as a rock in a stream, and the cords, which seemed so simple at the start, are now the backbone of a growing body of paper and thread. The afternoon light begins to climb down the wall, and the shadows shift to the right. You have sewn perhaps 20 gatherings, and your fingers are warm and limber from the repeated motion. The needle, once cold, has absorbed the heat of your hand and moves as if it were an extension of your own bones. You continue sewing, and the world outside continues its quiet existence. A cart passes in the lane, its driver calling something indistinct. The sound rises and falls and is gone. A bell chimes the hour. A bird lands on the window ledge, regards you for a moment with its glossy black eye, and then departs. The sewing frame does not notice any of this. Its attention is fixed on the cords and the paper, and so is yours. When the last gathering of the session is sewn, not the last of the book, for there is still more waiting in the tray, you tie off the kettle stitch with a secure knot, double looping it and pulling it tight, then snip the thread, leaving a short tail that will be hidden inside the spine later. You lift the entire sewn block from the frame, cradling it in both hands, and feel the weight of it, the solidity of the accumulated paper and thread. The cords extend from the spine, long and loose, ready to be trimmed and laced. You set the block down on the bench and cover it with a felt blanket to protect it from dust. The frame now stands empty, its cords slack because you have untied the lower ends from the cleats to release the book. You coil up the remaining waxed thread and place it in a small linen pouch for the next sewing session. The needle is wiped clean and returned to its clay dish. The lump of beeswax, slightly diminished, goes back into its bag. You run a cloth over the bed of the frame, wiping away any stray fibers of paper or thread, and then you step back. The room is still, but it feels different now, as if the sewing frame has exhaled a long breath after holding it for hours. You turn to look out the window and see that the sky has turned a pale, milky blue, with long strands of cloud stretching across the horizon. Your body feels tired in a pleasant way, a tiredness that is the result of sustained, focused attention rather than heavy exertion. You stretch your arms above your head and feel the vertebrae in your back shift and settle. The tasks that remain for the day, trimming the cords, checking the text block for loose stitches, are small and can wait. For now, you stand in the center of your workshop, surrounded by the tools and materials of your trade, and you feel a quiet contentment that is as simple and solid as the sewing frame itself. The window light is golden now, casting long shadows across the floor, and you know that in that light the sewing frame looks exactly as it has looked for years and exactly as it will look tomorrow when you sit down to sew the next gathering. The sewing frame stands before you in the morning light, its oak uprights darkened by the oil of countless hands, the crossbar set at a height that matches your collarbone when you sit. 3 double cords of unbleached linen hang from the crossbar, stretched taut and secured below, each passing through a notch in the bed of the frame exactly aligned with the sewing stations you marked on the first gathering. The cords are slightly rough to the touch, the fibers catching the light with a dull luster, and they give off a faint earthy smell when you draw close. You've already checked their tension by plucking them lightly, like the string of a lute, and the low thrum that answered told you they are ready. All that remains is to thread the needle and begin. You take your seat on the 3-legged stool, settle your weight evenly, and draw the small clay dish toward you. In it lies the curved sewing needle, a slender length of polished steel shaped into a gentle crescent so that it can slip in and out of folded gatherings without straining the paper. You pick up the spool of linen thread and measure a length from your fingertips to your elbow, then add another hand span, because the first gathering needs a tail long enough to tie the kettle stitch that will anchor the end. You cut the thread with a small knife kept for the purpose, its blade worn thin from sharpening. Then you take the lump of beeswax from the corner of the bench, a pale amber block that has captured the warmth of the room, and draw the thread through it twice, slowly, so that the wax coats every fiber with a thin, even film. The thread glides through your fingers now with a whispery smoothness, and you thread the needle with a single pass, pulling the end through until a short tail lies against the eye. The needle feels balanced in your hand, neither heavy nor light, and the waxed thread hangs from it with a gentle droop. You place the first gathering on the bed of the sewing frame, its folded spine resting against the upright board, and open it carefully to its exact center. The pages part willingly, as if they remember the fold. You locate the 3 marks on the inner fold that indicate where the cord stations should lie, 3 small graphite dots that you made earlier with a light touch. Beside them, at each end of the fold, are the kettle stations, slightly inset from the head and tail, where the gathering will be linked to its neighbors with a chain stitch. You align the gathering so that the cords pass through the small slits you cut at the marked stations, the paper opening just enough to admit the twisted linen without tearing. The cords lie flat against the inner fold now, 3 vertical lines of undyed fiber crossing the dark columns of print. You rest your left hand inside the gathering, spreading the pages lightly, and take the threaded needle in your right. You begin at the right-hand kettle station, the one nearest the tail of the book. The needle enters from the outside of the fold, piercing the paper at the exact spot you pricked, and you push it through with a steady pressure, feeling the slight resistance as the waxed thread follows. The tip emerges inside the gathering, and you draw the thread slowly until only a short tail remains on the outside, a tail of about 2 finger lengths that will later be tied off. Then you guide the needle back out over the first cord, looping the thread around it in a single smooth motion before re-entering the fold just on the other side. The loop closes snugly around the cord, not tight enough to compress the fibers, but firm enough to hold. This is the link stitch, the simplest and oldest way to secure a gathering to its supports. Your fingers know the motion without your mind having to direct it out, around, in, pull, then advance to the next cord. You move now to the middle cord, passing the needle once more from inside to out, looping the thread over the linen and returning inside. The stitch forms a cross on the outer surface of the spine, tiny and neat. Then the third cord receives the same treatment, the needle dipping and rising with the regularity of a small bird pecking at the ground. Finally, you reach the left-hand kettle station. Here you bring the needle out one last time, then loop the thread under the link that connects the previous gathering, but since this is the first gathering, there is no previous one to link to. Instead, you tie the tail left at the starting kettle station to the working thread with a simple knot, drawing them together until the gathering sits securely against the cords. You pass the needle back into the fold to hide the knot, and the first gathering is stitched. You sit back for a moment and examine your work. The thread lies flat along the inner fold. The stitch is small and regular, the 3 cords encased in their loops. The gathering now belongs to the frame, held in place by thread and tension, and it no longer seems like a loose collection of folded sheets, but like a component of something larger, something that will grow into a solid block. You run your thumb over the inner fold, smoothing the paper where the needle passed through, and the punctures close almost invisibly, leaving only a faint dimple. The spine edge viewed from above shows the 3 cords standing slightly proud between the kettle stitches, and you know that as more gatherings are added, this spine will swell and take on the characteristic rounded shape of a properly sewn book. You lift the first gathering, now fixed to the cords, and slide it gently toward the head of the frame so that it rests against the upright board. Then you reach for the second gathering, which has been waiting under the pressing board. You remove the stone weight, lift the board, and take the gathering with both hands, cradling it as you would a shallow bowl of water. You return the stone to its place and carry the new gathering to the frame. There you repeat the alignment, slipping the cords through the slits, opening the gathering to its center, and resting your left hand inside. The needle, still threaded and waxed, is ready. The second gathering is sewn in much the same way as the first, but with one small difference. When you reach the left-hand kettle station, you do not tie a new knot. Instead, you bring the needle out through the kettle hole, then pass it under the stitch that anchors the first gathering, forming a chain. You pull the thread through, and the 2 gatherings are linked by a tiny loop that lies flat against the spine. The motion is delicate, a small swoop of the needle, and you do it slowly to avoid pulling too hard and tearing the paper. The chain tightens with a soft click, and the second gathering sits snugly against the first, its spine edge parallel and true. You continue in this manner through the third gathering, and then the fourth. Each one is aligned, opened, and sewn with the same sequence of moves. In at the kettle, over the first cord, over the middle cord, over the third cord, out at the far kettle, and chained to the previous gathering. The thread slides through the wax block occasionally when it begins to drag, and you re-wax it with a quick pass that takes only a few seconds. The needle never pricks your finger, because the curve keeps the point away from your skin, and the thread never tangles, because you keep it coiled loosely on the bench beside you. The only variation is the slight difference in the thickness of each gathering, which you feel as a subtle change in the resistance when the needle pierces the paper. Thicker gatherings require a little more pressure. Thinner ones let the needle through with barely a whisper. Your hand adjusts automatically, maintaining an even tension on the thread so that no stitch is tighter or looser than its neighbors. The morning light continues its slow journey across the room, and the dust motes that dance in its beams seem to move in time with your stitching. The workshop is so quiet that you can hear the faint creak of the frame's joints as you work, a sound like the settling of old wood. Outside, the noises of Mainz ebb and flow. A cart passes, then silence. A dog barks twice, then silence. The church bell rings the quarter hour, then silence. You are aware of these sounds without listening to them, the way a person drifting towards sleep is aware of the rain on the roof without counting the drops. Your whole attention is narrowed to the space between your hands, the small world of paper, cord, and thread. After the sixth gathering, you pause to push the sewn block down along the cords. The gatherings have begun to accumulate thickness, and they need to be kept compact so that the spine does not fan out. You take the whole block between your fingers and thumbs and slide it toward the base of the frame, pressing gently until the gatherings sit firmly against one another. The spine exhales a tiny puff of air, the scent of old paper released, and you pat the top gathering flat before resuming. This settling of the block will be repeated many times, a small ritual that maintains the integrity of the spine. You lose count of the gatherings after a while, not because you are careless, but because the rhythm has absorbed you so completely that numbers seem unimportant. The needle dips, the thread follows, the cord accepts its loop, and the chain closes. Your breathing has slowed to match the pace of the stitching, and you find that you are blinking less often, your eyes resting on the work without strain. The waxed thread shines with a faint gleam, and the smell of beeswax mixes with the older odors of the bindery to create a scent that is honeyed and woody and dry. There is a deep contentment in this work, a contentment that comes from doing one thing and doing it slowly. When the stack of gatherings in the tray has diminished by half, you stand up to stretch your legs. The stall creaks in relief as your weight lifts, and you walk to the window, rolling your shoulders and flexing your fingers. The lane outside is empty now, the shadow short beneath a sun that has climbed to its peak. A patch of moss grows on the stone sill, bright green, and you touch it absently with a fingertip before turning back to the workshop. You pour water from the jug and drink, then pour a little more onto your palms and rub them together to restore the grip on your needle. The coolness of the water is a small shock that sharpens your senses for a moment, and then the warmth of the room reclaims you. Back at the frame, you slide a fresh gathering from the tray and open it to its center. The inner fold reveals a large watermark, a bull's head with a cross above it, visible as a translucent shape against the light. The papermaker's mark, laid into the pulp when the sheet was formed, reminds you that this paper traveled many miles before it reached Mainz, carried over roads and rivers by merchants whose names you will never know. Now it rests in your hands, about to become part of a book that will outlast you and everyone you have ever met. You smooth the fold with your thumb, and the watermark seems to shift slightly, a ghost in the paper. Then you align the gathering with the cords and resume the stitching. The afternoon wears on. The light through the windows takes on a golden quality, and the shadows in the corners of the room deepen. You have sewn more than 20 gatherings now, and the block on the cords is a substantial thing, heavy with paper and thread. The spine has begun to swell, the natural consequence of so many folded sections being compressed together, and the cords stand out more prominently now, like the ribs of a lean animal. You press the block down periodically, always with the same gentle firmness, and you check the tension of the cords by plucking them, listening for the low note that means they have not loosened. So far, they have held their pitch. At last, you reach the final gathering. It is slightly thinner than the others, a single sheet folded into 2 leaves that will serve as the end paper, a buffer between the board and the text. You stitch it in the same way as all the others, but when you reach the last kettle station, you do not chain to a subsequent gathering. Instead, you bring the needle out, wrap the thread twice around the final stitch to form a small bead, and pass the needle back into the fold. There you tie the thread to itself with a double knot, drawing it tight and letting it settle against the paper. The knot is tiny, a dark speck amid the columns of print. You snip the excess thread with your knife, and the final gathering is secure. You sit back and look at the sewn text block. It hangs on the sewing frame like a completed piece of weaving, the 3 cords running vertically through the spine, the gatherings stacked in perfect alignment. The foredge is a gentle curve, the head and tail are squared, and the spine shows the even rise and fall of each gathering, a texture like the ribs of a shell. You run a hand lightly over the spine and feel the slight unevenness of the cord loops beneath the kettle stitches, a tactile map of the hours you have spent. There is no loose thread, no slipped stitch, no tear in the paper. The block is sound. You untie the cords from the crossbar, releasing them with a few turns of the pegs, and lift the entire block free of the frame. It is surprisingly heavy, dense with the accumulated weight of so many pages, and you carry it to the lying press. There you set it gently on the bed, and leave it for now, because the next stages, rounding, backing, and lining, will come later. For the present, all that matters is that the sewing is done. The text block rests on the press, its cords trailing like loose ribbons, and you drape a clean cloth over it to keep off the dust. You clean the needle with a scrap of linen, wiping away the thin film of wax that has accumulated, and return it to its clay dish. The spool of thread goes back on the shelf, the beeswax block sits in its corner, and the sewing frame is moved aside, its cords coiled neatly over the crossbar. You sweep the floor around the frame with a small brush, gathering the tiny snippets of thread and the flecks of wax that have fallen during the work. Then you wash your hands one last time, letting the water run over your knuckles until they loosen. The bindery is dimmer now, the light outside fading from gold to a soft grey as the evening approaches. You stand for a moment with your apron still on, looking at the cloth-covered text block that contains all the sewn gatherings. It is a quiet thing, unmoving, but it holds within it the potential of a book. Tomorrow you will begin the rounding of the spine, but tonight the workshop is at peace. You remove your apron, hang it on its peg, and blow out the small flame in the brazier that has kept the glue warm all day. The room fills with the pleasant smell of extinguished charcoal, a smell that signals the end of labor. You step outside, pull the door shut, and walk into the cool evening air, leaving the sewn gatherings to rest in the dark. The sewing continues, and the rhythm of the curved needle becomes the quiet center around which the whole morning arranges itself. You are still seated on the stool before the frame, your apron smooth across your thighs, the light from the high windows falling in a steady, pale wash over the bench. The frame has not changed. Its uprights still hold the crossbar at the same height, and the 3 double cords still run from the bar down to the bed with the same measured tension you set hours ago. Nothing in the room has shifted, and yet something has altered, because you have moved from the deliberate, self-conscious stitching of the first few gatherings into a state where your hands seem to know what to do before your mind can form the thought. The needle finds its path by touch, guided by the small indentations left by the pricker, and the thread follows without hesitation. The work has become a long, slow river, and you are simply moving with its current. You pick up a new gathering from the stack on your left, where the felt-lined tray holds the remaining quires in a tidy pile. The gathering is being pressed flat under the stone, so its leaves are compact and even, the spine edge a straight line, the foredge a gentle curve. You open it to its center with a single motion, the paper parting where the fold was made, and you place it onto the bed of the frame so that the 3 cords slip through the small slits in the fold. Your left hand spreads the pages apart inside the gathering, creating a shallow valley of paper, while your right hand brings the threaded needle to the starting kettle station. You no longer look for the kettle hole. Your thumb knows exactly where it is. A tiny pinch in the paper that you made many gatherings ago, and the needle enters as if drawn by a gentle magnetism. The waxed thread glides through the paper with a soft hiss, a sound so familiar now that you hear it less as a noise and more as a texture in the silence. The stitch over the first cord follows immediately, the needle looping around the linen in a single fluid arc, then back into the fold just beyond the cord. You do not pull too hard. The tension is a thing your fingers have learned to judge without measuring. The loop settles against the cord with a slight tightening, and then you move to the middle cord, where the same motion repeats. Curve of needle, whisper of thread, gentle snug. The third cord receives its stitch in the same unhurried way, and then you are at the left-hand kettle station, where the needle emerges, dips under the chain stitch of the previous gathering, and returns inside to form the link that ties this gathering to the one before it. A soft click as the thread pulls taut and the gathering is fixed. You pause for a moment to push the newly sewn section down onto the cords, using the flats of your fingers to press it snug against the accumulating block. The gatherings have been building steadily, and each new one adds a slim thickness to the spine. You press gently but firmly, and the paper gives a tiny exhalation, a brief release of trapped air. The 3 cords now stand a little more proud between the gatherings, their fibers slightly compressed by the thread loops, but still strong and resilient. You run a thumb across the spine and feel the regular rise and fall of each gathering, like shallow steps descending from the head to the tail. Then you return your attention to the tray and pick up the next gathering. The The sequence repeats, and because it repeats, your mind is free to wander in the calm, directionless way that is the gift of repetitive work. You notice, without really noticing, that the room has grown warmer. The low brazier in the corner, which you lit early this morning to keep the glue pot at a gentle heat, has been glowing steadily, and its warmth has spread from the corner to fill the whole space. The glue inside the pot gives off a faint, sweet smell, something between boiled grain and animal hide, and this smell now mingles with the paper dust and the waxy scent of beeswax to create the characteristic perfume of the bindery. It is a smell you have known for years, and it settles in the back of your throat, like the memory of a taste. Your hands continue their work while your senses take in these small changes. You pick up a gathering, open it, align it, and the needle begins its journey. The thread hisses through the paper, the cord accepts its loop, the chain closes. You press the gathering down and reach for the next. The number of gatherings you have sewn ceases to hold any meaning. You count them not as numbers, but as a sensation of thickness, a gradual swelling of the spine under your palm. 5 gatherings, and the spine was thin and flat. 8 gatherings, and a slight convexity appeared. 12 gatherings, and the curve is unmistakable. A gentle outward bow that will later be shaped with the backing hammer into the perfect round of a finished book. Now the block rests in your hand with a new weight, a solidity that promises it will survive centuries of use. The needle finds the right holes by feel alone, as if the paper guides it. The indentation left by the pricker is so slight that an unpracticed eye would miss it, but your fingers read it like a familiar letter. You do not need to bend close or squint. Your posture remains easy, your shoulders relaxed, your breathing slow and even. The needle itself seems to have grown warmer from your touch, the steel absorbing the heat of your fingers until it feels less like a tool and more like an extension of your own hand. You stop occasionally to draw the thread across the block of beeswax. 2 swift passes that restore its smooth glide, and then you continue without having lost a beat. The sounds of the workshop arrange themselves into a quiet music. The hiss of the thread is the melody, variable in pitch and duration depending on the thickness of the gathering and the angle of the needle. Underneath it runs the soft percussion of your breathing, the creak of the stool when you shift your weight, and the occasional dull tap of the bone folder against the bench when you pause to smooth a fold. From outside, the city of Mainz sends its own distant orchestra, the regular ring of St. Martin's bell, the clop of a horse on cobblestones, the high call of a swallow hunting insects near the rooftops. But these external sounds are so muffled by the thick walls that they seem to belong to another world, a world that has nothing to do with the small, bright focus of the sewing frame. The church bell rings again, marking the hour, and you acknowledge it with a brief stillness of your hands, a moment in which you look up toward the window and see that the quality of the light has shifted. The morning's cool whiteness has given way to the warmer gold of midday, and the shadows on the floor have shortened and grown sharper. You realize that you've been sewing for a long time, perhaps 2 hours or more, though the time does not feel like a quantity, but like a texture, smooth and uninterrupted. The bell fades, and you return your gaze to the frame, where the next gathering waits with its inner fold exposed, the 2 columns of dense black-letter text facing upward like an open field. You sew that gathering, and the next, and the next. The rhythm is so steady that you sometimes close your eyes for a second, letting your hands work by touch alone. The needle enters the kettle hole, loops the cord, finds the exit, and chains to the previous gathering with a precision that seems to bypass thought entirely. When you open your eyes again, nothing has changed. The stitch is perfect, and the gathering sits snugly against its neighbors. You feel a quiet gratitude for this ability, a gift earned by years of repetition, and then you let the feeling go, because there is no room for pride in the middle of a rhythm. There is only the rhythm itself. The spine continues to swell. By the 20th gathering, the block has taken on a pleasing heft, its weight substantial in the hand, its edges square and true. The chords, which at the start lay almost flat against the spine, now stand out like 3 ridges separated by the shallow valleys of the kettle stitches. You pause in your sewing to press the block down again. Using both hands this time, your fingers spread wide over the gatherings to distribute the pressure evenly. The paper compresses with a soft sigh, and a puff of paper dust, fine as pollen, rises into the shaft of sunlight and dances there for a moment before settling. You then run a finger along the foredge of the block, checking that no gathering has slipped out of alignment. The foredge is smooth, a single continuous curve from the top to the bottom of the book, and you nod to yourself in quiet satisfaction before picking up the next gathering. The tray of unsewn quires is more than half empty now. You can see the bottom of the felt lining in places, and the remaining gatherings seem lighter, fewer, though you know there are still many to go. You do not hurry, because hurrying would serve no purpose. A stitch pulled too tight might tear the paper, and a stitch left too loose would allow the gatherings to shift. The right tension is a middle path, and you walk it with the same unhurried step you have walked it for years. Your fingers never falter, and the needle never pricks your skin. It is as if the work is doing itself through you, and you are merely the vessel through which the thread passes. As the morning deepens into early afternoon, you become aware of a subtle change in the texture of the thread. The beeswax has begun to wear off more quickly now, perhaps because the needle has grown slightly warm and the wax is softening. You pause to re-wax the thread, drawing it across the block 3 times instead of the usual 2, and then you pull it through a fold of linen to remove the excess. The thread emerges supple and slightly glossy, ready for another long stretch of sewing. You also wipe the needle with a clean rag, because a thin film of wax and paper dust has accumulated near the eye, and a clean needle passes through the paper more easily. These small acts of maintenance are part of the rhythm too, brief pauses that allow you to take a deeper breath and settle your shoulders before returning to the frame. The glue pot on the brazier burbles softly to itself, its contents now fully liquefied and translucent. The smell of warm glue has grown stronger, filling the workshop with its thick animal sweetness, and it blends with the other odors until you can no longer distinguish one from another. The whole room smells simply like the bindery, a smell that is as familiar to you as your own skin. A fly buzzes lazily near the window, its path erratic, and you watch it for a moment as it bumps softly against the glass. Then it finds an open crack and disappears into the outside air, and you are alone again with the sewing frame. Your body has settled into a posture of perfect ease. Your back is straight, but not rigid. Your elbows rest lightly against your sides, and your feet are planted flat on the floor. You breathe deeply from your belly, the way a sleeper breathes, and your heartbeat has slowed to a pace that matches the rhythm of the stitches. Time, which earlier felt like a sequence of hours marked by bells, now feels like a single continuous moment, an endless present, in which the only change is the gradual growth of the text block. You do not know whether it is late morning or early afternoon, and you do not care. The light on the bench is still golden, and the shadows have not yet begun to lengthen. But beyond that, you have no measure of the day. There is only the needle, the thread, the cord, the paper, and the quiet music they make together. You sew another gathering, then another. The spine is now noticeably rounded, a gentle arc that mirrors the shape of the foredge, and the cords have taken on the character of strong, taut sinews that will anchor the boards securely. You run your thumb along one cord and feel its slight fuzziness, the fibers softened by the repeated passage of the thread, but still intact and unbroken. The kettle stitches form a neat ladder along the spine, each rung a gathering, and the whole assembly has a beauty that is entirely functional, the beauty of a thing made well for a purpose. You think, briefly, of the hands that will one day open this book, hands that may belong to a scholar in a distant monastery, or a monk in a scriptorium far from Mainz. Those hands will feel the heft of the binding, the smooth curve of the spine, the slight ridges of the cords under the leather, and they will not think of you. They will simply open the book and read, and that is as it should be. The thought passes, and you pick up the next gathering. When the tray is finally empty and the last gathering has been sewn, you sit for a moment with the needle still in your hand, the thread trailing from its eye. The text block is complete, a solid mass of paper and thread and cord that weighs on the bed of the sewing frame like a stone. The spine is plumper than it was when you began. Its swell even and symmetrical, the 3 cords emerging from it at regular intervals like the ribs of a well-made basket. You slide your hand under the block and lift it slightly, testing its weight, and it feels substantial, a thing that will endure. You tie off the final kettle stitch with a double knot, the needle dipping and pulling in a small, precise flourish, and then you snip the thread with your knife. The tail of the thread falls onto the bench, and you brush it into your palm and drop it into the scrap basket. The sewing is finished. You release the cords from the lower cleats, untying the half hitches with a few quick tugs, and then you lift the crossbar to free the upper ends. The cords now dangle loosely from the text block, long and trailing, ready to be laced into the wooden boards when that stage arrives. You carry the block to the lying press, cradling it in both arms, and set it down on the press bed. It rests there, heavy and quiet, and you drape a clean felt cloth over it to keep the dust away while you clean up the bench. You wipe the needle one last time and place it in its clay dish. Then coil the remaining wax thread and return it to the spool on the shelf. The lump of beeswax, now noticeably smaller than it was at the start of the day, goes back into its linen bag. You push the sewing frame to the side of the bench, its cords looped neatly over the crossbar, and you carry the tray of empty felt back to its shelf. Then you sweep the floor around the stool, gathering the tiny scraps of thread and the dust of wax that have fallen during the hours of work. The broom makes a soft, rhythmic sound against the floorboards. Shush, shush, shush. And with each stroke, the bindery becomes a little tidier, a little more settled. When the sweeping is done, you stand in the middle of the room and listen. The brazier still ticks, the glue still bubbles, the light still falls through the windows in long golden shafts. But the sewing frame is silent, its work completed, and the room feels subtly different now, as if it has exhaled a long-held breath. You walk to the basin and wash your hands, letting the water run over your knuckles until the slight stiffness from gripping the needle eases away. You dry your hands on your apron and then remove the apron, hanging it on its peg by the door. It is afternoon now, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the rooftops, and the lane outside is waking briefly from the midday lull. You hear the voice of a neighbor greeting another, the bark of a dog, the distant ringing of the St. Martin bell marking the half hour. The world goes about its business, unaware of the book that has just been sewn in the quiet workshop. You open the door a crack and breathe the cooler air, then close it again and return to the bench. The covered text block waits on the lying press, patient and still, and you place your hand on the felt for a moment, feeling the solid mass beneath. Tomorrow you will round the spine and begin the work of attaching the boards, but for now the only thing left to do is rest. You sit on the stool one last time, your hands empty, your mind quiet, and you let the peaceful silence of the bindery settle over you like a blanket. The sewn text block rests on the bed of the lying press where you left it the evening before, covered by a square of felt that has kept the dust from settling on the pages overnight. You remove the felt carefully, folding it once and setting it aside on the bench, and then you stand for a moment looking at the block. It is a solid thing now, thick and heavy, its spine a landscape of small ridges and valleys where the gatherings meet. The 3 double cords extend from the spine like the roots of a plant pulled from the soil, long and unbleached and slightly fuzzy where the thread has passed over them many times. The foredge opposite the spine curves in a gentle concave, the natural result of so many folded sections being sewn together under tension. The block as a whole is still flat along the spine, because no shaping has yet been done, and your task this morning is to give it the rounded back that will allow the book to open easily and sit well in its future boards. You wash your hands in the stone basin, the water cool and clear, and dry them on a scrap of linen. Then you tie on your apron and move the lying press to the center of the workbench, where the light falls most directly. The press is a sturdy thing made of beechwood, its 2 horizontal cheeks connected by a large wooden screw that you can turn with an iron bar. The cheeks are padded with strips of leather where they meet the book, to prevent the wood from marking the paper. You open the press by turning the screw counterclockwise, and the upper cheek rises slowly, creaking a little, until there is enough space to insert the text block. You lift the block in both hands and place it between the cheeks, spine upward, with the cords hanging free on either side. Then you turn the screw clockwise until the cheeks grip the block firmly about a finger's width below the spine. The pressure must be enough to hold the book steady, but not so much that the paper is crushed, and you test the tightness by trying to wiggle the block with your fingers. It does not move. You are satisfied. Beside the press, on the bench, you have laid out the tools you will need: the backing hammer, a pair of beveled wooden backing boards, a small pot of paste, a brush, and a clean cloth. The backing hammer is a specialized tool, its head made of iron but faced with a smooth, slightly convex surface that will shape the spine without cutting the paper. The handle is of ash, worn dark where your palm grips it, and the weight of the head is balanced so that it can deliver light, controlled blows. You pick it up and feel its familiar heft, then set it down within easy reach. The backing boards are two long rectangles of hardwood, their edges beveled at a shallow angle, and they will be placed along the joints of the book to define the shoulders where the boards will later hinge. You check the boards for splinters, running your thumb along the bevel, and find them smooth and ready. Before you begin hammering, you apply a thin coating of paste to the spine. The paste is the same flour-based adhesive you use for many tasks in the bindery, cooked slowly until it is smooth and white, then thinned with a little water to a consistency that spreads easily. You stir the pot with a bone spatula, lifting a small amount onto the brush, and then paint it onto the spine in long, even strokes. The paste soaks into the outer folds of the gatherings, darkening the paper slightly, and its moisture will make the fibers pliable so that they can be shaped without cracking. You work from the head to the tail, covering every fold, every kettle stitch, and every cord loop with a thin, uniform layer. The smell of the paste is mild and grainy, like oatmeal left to cool, and adjoins the other smells of the workshop without overwhelming them. When the spine is evenly coated, you set the brush aside and wipe your fingers on the cloth. Now you take the two backing boards and position them on either side of the text block, their beveled edges facing inward toward the spine. The boards sit flush against the cheeks of the press, and you adjust them so that the bevels are exactly aligned with the joint line, the place where the spine meets the body of the book. This joint is where the book will flex when it is opened, and the bevel will create a small, angled shoulder that gives the boards a place to rest. You hold the boards in place with one hand and tighten the press a fraction more with the other, so that the boards are clamped securely against the block. The spine now protrudes above the bevels by about the thickness of your little finger, a shallow dome of paper ready to be shaped. You take up the backing hammer and hold it loosely in your right hand, the handle resting across your palm. The first blow is the lightest, a mere tap on the center of the spine, more a test than a shaping stroke. The hammerhead meets the paper with a soft, muffled thud, and you feel the vibration travel up the handle and dissipate in your wrist. Nothing visible happens, but you are not trying to move the paper all at once. The rounding of a spine is a gradual process, achieved by many small blows rather than a few large ones, and patience is the only tool that matters now. You tap again, slightly to the left of center, then again to the right, and with each tap, the spine begins to respond, its flat surface slowly yielding into a gentle curve. The rhythm of the hammer is different from the rhythm of the needle, but it is a rhythm nonetheless. You work from the center outward, tapping first the middle of the spine, then moving toward the head, then back to the center, then toward the tail. Each blow is light and glancing, the hammerhead landing at a slight angle so that it pushes the paper outward rather than compressing it straight down. The sound is a series of soft, padded thuds, like a finger drumming on a cushion, and it fills the workshop with a gentle percussion that is oddly soothing. Your arm moves from the elbow, not the shoulder, and the motion is small and economical, without any wasted effort. The spine begins to round. The paper, softened by the paste, yields to the hammer and starts to fan out over the bevels of the backing boards, taking on a convex shape that will become the familiar arched back of a bound book. At the same time, the foredge, which was a concave curve, now deepens into a more pronounced hollow. The pages shifting slightly against one another as the spine pushes outward. The two shapes, the outward bow of the spine and the inward curve of the foredge, are complements, and achieving them both in harmony is the goal of the rounding. You pause to check the symmetry of the curve, stepping back from the press and sighting along the spine from the head to the tail. The left side is slightly fuller than the right, so you apply a few gentle taps to the right side, nudging the paper over until the curve is even. Then you return to the center and continue tapping. The paste begins to dry as you work, its moisture evaporating into the warm air of the workshop. You can see the color of the spine lightening from the dark, wet shade back toward the natural cream of the paper, and you know that you must complete the rounding before the paste sets completely. You brush on a little more paste at the head and tail, where the paper is often stiffer and requires extra moisture to shape. The brush leaves fine, parallel lines in the paste, and the hammer soon smooths them away. You work steadily, without haste, and the spine gradually assumes the rounded profile of a finished book. The curve is not a perfect arc of a circle. It is slightly asymmetrical, organic, a shape that has been guided by hand rather than drawn with a compass. This is the nature of handmade things, and you do not try to correct its small irregularities because they are part of its character. When the curve satisfies you, you shift your attention to the shoulders. The shoulders are the ridges that will form along the joint lines, where the beveled edges of the backing boards press into the paper. These ridges will provide a recess for the wooden boards to fit into, so that the boards sit flush with the spine and the book can open and close smoothly. To create the shoulders, you change the angle of your hammer blows, tapping more directly downward along the joint lines rather than glancing across the spine. The hammerhead meets the paper with a slightly firmer thud, and the paper begins to fold over the bevels, forming two distinct ridges that run from the head to the tail on either side of the spine. You work from the center toward the head, then from the center toward the tail, tapping the joint line at each gathering junction, and the shoulders emerge gradually, like raised seams in a piece of fabric. The sound of the hammer changes as you work the joints, becoming crisper and more defined, a series of small, sharp taps that mark the creation of the hinge. This part of the process requires more care than the general rounding because the shoulders must be even and straight. If one shoulder is deeper than the other, the boards will not sit level, and the book will twist when it is closed. You check the depth of the shoulders frequently by running your fingertip along the joint line, feeling the ridge beneath the paper. The left shoulder matches the right within a hair, and you continue tapping with small, precise strokes, refining the shape until both sides feel identical. The paper has become quite soft from the paste and the repeated tapping, and it molds itself around the bevels with a kind of gentle obedience, as if it has been waiting to take this shape all along. After a time, you decide that the shoulders are deep enough. They stand out clearly from the spine, two parallel ridges that will receive the boards with a snug fit, and the curve of the spine between them is even and pleasing. You set down the hammer, its handle warm from your grip, and loosen the press screw to release the text block. The cheeks of the press fall away, and you lift the block out, cradling it in your hands. You turn it over and examine the foredge. It has deepened into a smooth, even hollow. The pages shifted just enough to create the complementary curve. You run your palm over the spine, feeling the new shape, the way it arches under your hand. The paste has dried almost completely, leaving the paper slightly stiff but no longer tacky. The three chords emerge from the spine at their regular intervals, and the kettle stitches are still visible as a neat ladder of tiny punctures, now stretched a little by the rounding. Everything about the block has been altered by the hammer, yet nothing has been damaged. The paper is intact, the thread is secure, and the gatherings remain tightly bound together. You place the rounded block on a clean sheet of waste paper on the bench and let it rest while you clean the hammer and the press. The hammerhead is wiped with a dry cloth to remove any residue of paste, and the handle is given a quick rub with a scrap of linen to remove the moisture from your palm. You brush the paste pot and set it aside, its surface now sealed with a disc of damp paper to keep it from skinning over. The backing boards are wiped down and leaned against the wall, and the press is loosened fully, its screw turned back until the cheeks stand open and relaxed. You sweep the few specks of dried paste from the bench and drop them into the scrap basket. Now you return to the text block and pick it up once more. The rounded spine gives the book a sense of completeness, a physical presence that was not there when it was merely a stack of sewn gatherings. It feels like a book now, or something very close to a book, and you feel the quiet satisfaction that comes from seeing a shape emerge under your hands. You carry it to the window, where the light is brighter, and hold it at arm's length to study the silhouette. The curve of the spine is a smooth, dark arc against the pale sky outside, and the shoulders are straight and even. You turn it over and look at the foredge, which curves inward with a hollow deep enough to admit a finger. The head and tail are still slightly uneven, and you know that later, after the boards are attached, you will trim the edges to make them perfectly square. But for now they are left as they are, because the trimming is a separate task that requires its own set of tools and its own patient mourning. The afternoon has arrived without your noticing it. The light through the windows has shifted from the clear gold of midday to a softer, more diffused light, and the shadows have begun their slow lengthening across the floor. The bells of St. Light. Martin have rung several times during the morning, but you could not say how many times because the sound of the hammer muffled all other sounds. Now the workshop is quiet again, the only noise being the faint tick of the cooling brazier and the distant murmur of the street. You realize that you are tired, a pleasant tiredness that comes from using your arms rhythmically for a long time, and you roll your shoulders to ease the slight ache in your muscles. You decide that the text block should rest overnight under a light weight to allow the paper to settle into its new shape and to dry completely before you begin the backing and lining. You find 2 small felt pads and place them on either side of the spine, then set the block back into the press, this time just snugly, with the screw turned only enough to hold it upright. The weight of the block itself will do most of the pressing, and the felt pads will prevent the shoulders from being flattened. You lay a strip of clean linen over the spine to keep off the dust, and then you step away from the bench. Your apron comes off and is hung on its peg. Your hands are washed, the water running brownish for a moment before it clears, taking with it the fine grit of dried paste. You dry your hands and pour a cup of water from the jug, drinking it slowly while you stand by the window. Outside, the lane is quiet, the carters and vendors having retreated for the afternoon rest. A single pigeon sits on the stone ledge, its feathers puffed against the mild air. You watch it for a moment, and then it flies off with a clap of wings, its path arcing toward the river. You turn away from the window and survey the workshop one last time before you leave. The tools are in their places. The press is closed, but not tight. The text block rests under its linen. Everything is orderly and calm. You pull the door open, step into the lane and close it softly behind you, leaving the round-backed book to sleep in the dim, quiet bindery. The wooden boards that will protect the text block and give the book its solid, lasting form have been waiting beneath the workbench for many weeks, stacked flat and separated by slips of waste paper to keep their surfaces from scratching. You kneel down and lift the top 2 boards from the stack, holding them by their edges so that the oils from your fingers do not stain the grain. The boards are quarter-sawn oak, cut from a single log that was felled somewhere in the forests upriver and floated to Mainz on a barge, then sawn into planks and left to season in a shed for several years before a carpenter planed them smooth. Each board is slightly larger than the pages of the Bible, about the length of your forearm from elbow to fingertip, and a little wider than the text block, with a thickness roughly equal to the depth of your thumb joint. The wood is pale brown, with a straight, close grain that shows faint medullary rays running across the surface like ripples on still water. You carry the boards to the workbench and lay them side by side, their inner faces upward, and the bench seems to settle under their weight as if welcoming a familiar load. You take a moment to examine each board carefully, turning it over in your hands and running your palm across the surface. The face that will rest against the book is slightly smoother than the outer face because the carpenter who planed them paid extra attention to the side that would meet the paper. You find no knots or cracks, only the fine, even grain and a few tiny dark spots where the saw once paused. The edges are square and true, and when you hold a straight edge against them, no light shines through. These boards have been well made, and they will serve their purpose for a long time. You set them down and wipe the bench clean of any dust or grit that might scratch the wood while you work, using a dry cloth and passing it slowly across the surface several times until nothing remains. Next to the boards you gather the tools you will need: a leather ruler marked with small notches, a graphite stick for marking, a small chisel with a blade the width of your little fingernail, a light mallet made of beechwood, a gimlet with a handle polished by use, a scrap of sand shark skin, and a small dish of water with a soft cloth. You arrange these items within easy reach, reassuring yourself that everything is in its proper place before you begin. The morning light falls across the bench from the high windows, steady and white, and the room is quiet except for the occasional pop of the brazier and the distant call of a bird. You sit on the stool, draw the first board toward you, and pick up the leather ruler. The channels you are about to cut will receive the 3 double cords that extend from the spine of the text block. These cords must sink into the boards so that they lie flush with the surface when pasted and pulled through, leaving a smooth inner face that will not rub against the end papers. The positions of the channels correspond to the sewing stations you marked long ago on the gatherings, the same stations where the cords sit on the spine. Using the leather ruler, you measure from the top edge of the board down to the point where the first cord will cross, a distance you take directly from the text block by holding the block against the board and marking the chord positions with a light graphite dot. The top chord will sit a little more than a handspan from the head, the middle chord another handspan below, and the bottom chord an equal distance from the tail, though the exact spacings vary slightly because the gatherings are not all of perfectly uniform thickness. You make the marks on the inner face of the board, 3 small dots in a vertical line near the spine edge, and then you use the ruler to extend each mark into a horizontal line running from the spine edge inward for about 3 finger widths. These lines will be the center lines of your channels. With a sharp graphite point, you now draw the boundaries of each channel. The channel must be slightly wider than the cord itself, because the cord will fray slightly when you pick its end apart for lacing, and it needs room to spread. You make 2 parallel lines for each channel, about a finger's width apart, enclosing the center line. The result is 3 long, narrow rectangles drawn on the inner face of the board, each one running from the spine edge toward the center, perfectly parallel to one another. You check the spacing again by laying the text block on top of the board, aligning the spine with the spine edge, and verifying that the chords fall exactly within the drawn channels. The fit is true, the chords settling into their places as naturally as a foot into a familiar shoe, and you lift the block away and set it back on its felt pad. Now you take the chisel and the mallet. The chisel is sharp enough to pare the oak without splintering, and you test its edge gently with the pad of your thumb before you begin. You position the chisel at the near end of the first channel, the bevel facing upward, and tap the handle lightly with the mallet to set the blade into the wood. The mallet strikes with a dull wooden thud, a sound that is muffled rather than sharp, because the mallet head is made of the same beech as the press, and it absorbs its own noise. You work the chisel along the drawn lines, cutting shallow incisions that define the sides of the channel. Then you turn the chisel flat, bevel down, and begin to pare out the wood between the incisions, removing thin shavings one by one. The shavings curl up like tiny scrolls, pale and fragrant, and they fall onto the bench with a dry rustle. The scent of fresh cut oak rises into the air, clean and slightly sweet, a smell that mingles with the lingering odor of paste and leather to create something that is both new and ancient. You work slowly, measuring the depth of the channel often by holding a scrap of cord in the groove. The channel must be exactly as deep as the cord is thick, so that when the cord is laid in and pasted, its top surface will be flushed with the surrounding wood. Too shallow and the cord will stand proud and prevent the end paper from lying flat. Too deep and the board will be weakened. You take small pairings, testing and retesting, until the cord rests in the channel with its highest fibers just level with the board surface. When the first channel is done, you blow the wood dust away, a soft puff of breath that sends the fine particles swirling into the shaft of sunlight, and then you begin the second channel. The repetition of the work settles your mind, and you fall into a quiet pattern. Set the chisel, tap, par, test, blow, repeat. The mallet rises and falls with a gentle, regular beat, and the oak yields its substance in thin, measured increments. After the 3 channels on the first board are cut to your satisfaction, you pick up the second board and repeat the entire process. The measurements are identical because the 2 boards must be mirror images of one another, but you measure them independently anyway, using the text block as your guide rather than copying numbers from the first board. This caution ensures that any slight variation in the sewing stations is accounted for individually, and the result is a pair of channels that match the chords perfectly on each side. The second board takes a little less time than the first because your hands are now warm and practiced, and the chisel moves with a sure, unhurried rhythm. When you finish, you set both boards on the bench and brush away the wood shavings with a soft brush, collecting the shavings into a small pile that you will later add to the kindling box. The channels lie open on the inner faces, 6 rectilinear grooves that run inward from the spine edges in 3 neat pairs, their bottoms smooth and their sides straight. With the channels cut, you now turn your attention to the holes through which the cord ends will pass from the inner face to the outer face. These holes must be drilled at an oblique angle, slanting outward from the end of each channel to the outer surface of the board, so that the cord can travel through the wood and be trimmed flush on the outside. You pick up the gimlet, a small hand drill with a spiral tip and a wooden handle that fits snugly in your palm. The gimlet is a simple tool. Its steel shaft warm dark, but it is sharp and true, and its handle has been shaped by use until it sits in your hand like an old friend. You position the tip of the gimlet at the far end of the first channel, where the cord will exit the groove, and you tilt it at an angle so that it points toward the outer face of the board about a thumb's width from the spine edge. Then you begin to turn it. Slowly at first, the spiral tip biting into the oak with a soft grinding sound. Your wrist rotates in small circles, and the gimlet advances a fraction of a grain with each turn, sending up tiny curls of pale wood that spiral around the shaft like a loosened spring. You drill patiently, pausing every few turns to withdraw the gimlet and clear the hole of debris. Each time you pull it out, a small puff of wood dust follows, and you blow it gently aside before reinserting the tip. The sound of the drilling is a low, continuous murmur, like the hum of a distant insect, and it adds another layer to the quiet music of the workshop. The hole grows deeper by slow degrees, and to check its angle often by sighting along the board from the edge, making sure it will emerge at the right spot on the outer face. A hole drilled too steeply will break out too close to the spine edge and weaken the wood. A hole too shallow will exit too far inward and leave an unsightly depression. You steer a middle course, guided by years of practice, and the tip of the gimlet finally breaks through the outer surface with a faint crunch, leaving a clean, round opening no wider than the cord itself. You test the hole by threading a scrap of cord through it, pulling it from the channel to the outside, and the cord passes smoothly without binding. Satisfied, you move on to the next channel, and then the next, until all 6 holes are drilled, 3 on each board. Now you smooth every surface where the cords will lie. The channels, though carefully cut, have minute irregularities left by the chisel, and the holes have small burrs around their rims from the drilling. You take the scrap of sand shark skin, a piece of grey granular hide that feels rough to the touch but not abrasive enough to scratch the oak deeply, and you fold it around your fingertip. With small circular motions, you rub the bottom and sides of each channel, working from the spine edge inward until the groove feels as smooth as polished bone. The sand shark skin makes a soft rasping sound, and its grit gently levels the high spots and softens the sharp edges left by the chisel. You then take a pointed scrap of the same skin and twist it gently inside each drilled hole, reaming it to remove any splinters that might catch the cord fibers when they are pulled through. The holes become smooth and slightly burnished, their edges rounded and clean. With the channels and holes prepared, you wipe each board with the damp cloth you set out earlier. The cloth is only slightly moist because too much water would raise the grain too aggressively, but a light pass is enough to swell the outermost wood fibers just a little. As the water soaks in, the grain becomes more visible, the medullary rays standing out in silvery lines that catch the light. You let the boards rest for a few minutes while the moisture evaporates, and then you rub them down one final time with a dry cloth, removing the last traces of dust and leaving the surfaces smooth and ready. The oak now has a slight nap to it, a texture that will grip the paste when the time comes to glue the cords in place, and the color has deepened to a warm golden brown that seems to glow in the soft light. Before you set the boards aside, you perform one last test fit with the text block. You bring the block to the bench, still resting on its felt pad, and lift it carefully so as not to disturb the rounded spine. With one hand, you hold the first board against the spine, aligning the spine edge with the shoulder you hammered into the gatherings. The projecting cord ends, which you have left long and untrimmed, fall naturally into the channels you have cut, and you thread them gently through the holes to the outer face, pulling them taut so that the board draws snug against the shoulder. The fit is exact. The cords sit flush in their grooves, the board meets the shoulder evenly along its full length, and the text block rests squarely within the boundaries of the board. You repeat the test with the second board, and it fits just as truly. For a moment, you hold the whole assembly together in your hands, the text block between its 2 future covers, and you feel the quiet completeness of the structure. The boards are not yet glued, the cords are not yet trimmed, but the book has taken a long step toward its final form. You disassemble the test fit gently, pulling the cords back through the holes and laying the boards down on the bench side by side, their inner faces upward, ready for the gluing and lacing that will come later. You clean the tools with the same care you always use. The chisel is wiped with an oily rag to prevent rust. The mallet is dusted with the brush, and the gimlet is freed of any wood dust clinging to its spiral tip. The sand shark skin is tapped gently against the bench to dislodge its accumulated grit, then returned to the shelf. The leather ruler is coiled and placed in its box. The graphite stick is sharpened with a small knife and laid in the groove on the bench where it always rests. You sweep the wood shavings from the floor around the stool and add them to the basket, which now holds a mixture of paper scraps, thread clippings, and pale oak curls that will serve as tinder for the hearth when the weather turns cold. The damp cloth is rinsed in the basin and hung over the edge to dry, and the dish of water is emptied out the window onto the cobblestones below, where it splashes softly and then vanishes into the cracks. You stand for a moment looking at the two boards lying on the bench. The channels you have cut are the first marks any tool has made on them since the carpenter planed them square, and they give the oak a sense of purpose, a direction for its future life as part of a bound book. The pale grooves and the dark holes are like a script written in wood, a set of instructions that the cords will follow when they are pasted and pulled through. The boards themselves seem patient as the sewing frame and the lying press and all the other tools in the workshop. They will wait for the next stage without complaint, without any sense of hurry, because they are oak, and oak has learned over centuries to measure time in seasons rather than hours. Your hands are dry from handling the wood, and you rinse them in the basin, feeling the cool water soothe the small scratches left by the sand shark skin and the faint ache in your wrists from turning the gimlet. You dry your hands on your apron and then remove the apron, hanging it on its peg with a smooth, habitual motion. The light through the windows has begun its slow retreat, the shadows lengthening across the floor and climbing the far wall inch by inch. The workshop is as quiet as it was this morning, but the quiet now has a different quality, a sense of completion that the morning lacked. You take one last look at the boards before you leave. They rest on the bench, their channels open to the air, their grain glowing softly in the fading light. Beside them, the text block waits under its linen cover, its spine round and its cords trailing like loose thoughts. Tomorrow you will bring them together with paste and mallet. But for now the workshop holds its peace, and you step out into the cool evening air, closing the door gently behind you. The paste you will use to fix the cords into the wooden boards is the same flour paste you have used for many tasks in the bindery. A simple mixture of wheat flour and water cooked slowly over a low fire until it thickens to a smooth, white, semi-translucent gel. You keep it in a small lidded pot on the corner of the workbench, and each morning you warm it gently over the brazier until it reaches the consistency of soft butter. This morning you have already stirred the pot, breaking the skin that formed on its surface overnight and working the paste with a bone spatula until it is glossy and uniform. The smell is mild and grainy, a clean scent that has become so familiar to you over the years that you hardly notice it any more than you notice the smell of your own skin. You set the pot on a tile beside the lying press, where it will stay warm but not too hot, and you cover it loosely with a piece of damp linen to keep it from drying out while you work. The two oak boards lie on the bench where you left them the evening before, their inner faces upward, the channels and drilled holes clean and smooth from the work of the chisel and the sand shark skin. Beside them rests the text block, its rounded spine protected by a felt pad, the three double cords extending from each side like lengths of unspun rope. You lift the felt pad away and set it aside, then take a moment to examine the cords. They are slightly stiff from the paste you applied during the rounding a thin residue that dried overnight and left the fibers a little crisp. You take each cord between your thumb and forefinger and roll it gently, breaking the stiffness without fraying the twist, until the cords are soft and pliable again. The fibers blim slightly under your touch, the individual strands separating just enough to create a fuzzy surface that will grit the paste and bond firmly with the wood. You then pick the ends of each cord apart with a pointed bone folder, unraveling the last finger width of twist so that the cord ends spread into a small fan of loose fibers. This fanning will help the cord pass through the drilled holes more easily and will give the paste more surface area to hold when the ends are hammered flat on the outside of the boards. Now you are ready to begin the lacing. You move the first board into position at the edge of the bench, its inner face upward and its spine edge aligned with the shoulder of the text block. The block itself rests on a padded cradle you have made by rolling a strip of felt into a cylinder, which supports the round of the spine and prevents the weight of the block from flattening the shape you hammered so carefully. You slide the board toward the block until the spine edge just kisses the shoulder, and you check that the cords fall naturally into their channels without being forced or bent. The 3 cords lie in their grooves like roots, settling into prepared soil, their fanned ends extending exactly to the drilled holes at the far ends of the channels. The fit is true, and you lift the board away again, leaving the text block resting on its cradle while you apply the paste. You take a small brush from the jar beside the paste pot, a brush made of hog bristle bound to a wooden handle with linen thread, its tip worn to a soft wedge by use. You dip the brush into the paste and draw it across the rim of the pot to remove the excess, leaving just a thin, even coating on the bristles. Then you lean over the first board and begin to paint the paste into one of the channels, starting at the far end where the cord will exit through the hole. The brush moves in slow, straight strokes, laying down a film of paste that fills the bottom of the channel without pooling at the edges. The paste is cool and smooth, and it glistens faintly in the morning light as you work it into the grain of the oak. You make sure to coat the sides of the channel as well as the bottom, because the cord will press against all the surfaces when it is pulled tight, and every part that touches the wood must be bonded. You then move to the second channel and paint it in the same way, then the third, until all 3 channels on the first board have received their layer of adhesive. The paste takes on a slightly bluish translucency as it begins to dry on the surface, but it remains tacky and receptive, and you know from long experience that you have a comfortable amount of time before it sets. With the channels pasted, you lift the first board and bring it once more to the text block. You align the spine edge with the shoulder, and you lay the first cord into its channel, pressing it down with the tip of the bone folder so that it settles into the paste. The cord sinks into the groove with a soft, wet sound, and you work it flat with the folder, smoothing the fibers along the length of the channel until the cord is fully seated and its top surface lies level with the surrounding wood. You then take the fanned end of the cord and twist it gently into a point, a loose point that will pass through the drilled hole without catching. You guide this point into the hole at the end of the channel, and with a steady, gentle push, you begin to draw the cord through the board. The paste lubricates the fibers, and the cord slides through the hole with a faint rasp, emerging on the outer face of the board like a pale worm poking from the wood. You pull the cord from the outside, drawing it through until the board is snug against the shoulder of the text block, and there is no slack left in the channel. The cord is now laced, it lies pasted in its groove, passes through the board at an angle and emerges on the outer face, where a short length will later be trimmed and hammered flush. You repeat this process with the second cord, laying it into its pasted channel, pressing it flat with the folder, twisting the fanned end, and drawing it through the hole to the outside. Then the third cord follows, and when all 3 are laced, you set down the folder and wipe your fingers on the damp cloth. The first board is now attached to the text block, held by the 3 cords that pass through the wood and by the paste that bonds the fibers to the oak. The board rests against the shoulder with an even gap the width of a thread along the joint, a gap that will allow the book to open and close without straining. You test the movement by lifting the board gently away from the block. It opens smoothly, hinging on the cords, and when you let it fall closed, it settles back into place with a soft, satisfying clap. The fit is good, the shoulder deep enough to accommodate the board without pinching, the cords strong and true. You now turn the text block and cradle it so that the second side is facing upward, the unattached board waiting beside it on the bench. The process repeats, and you fall into the same rhythm you established with the first board, a rhythm that is methodical and unhurried. You paint the paste into the 3 channels of the second board, working the brush into the corners and along the sides, making sure the coating is even and unbroken. The smell of the paste rises around you, clean and slightly sweet, and the warmth of the brazier keeps the pot at the right temperature so that the paste does not skin over while you work. You lift the second board, align it with the shoulder, and begin lacing the first cord. The folder presses the cord into the paste, the fibers yield and settle, the fanned end is twisted and guided through the hole, and the cord emerges on the outside with a soft pull. Each cord takes only a few moments to set in place, but you do not rush. The folder moves at the same measured pace each time, and your breathing stays slow and even, your shoulders relaxed. When all 6 cords have been laced and both boards are attached, you set the text block upright on the bench, resting on its spine, and you look at it from above. The 2 boards stand open like the covers of a book that has not yet decided whether to close, the text block hanging between them. its head and tail square to the boards. You run a finger along the joints on both sides, feeling the slight spring of the cords as they flex within the board. The shoulders are even, the boards align with one another, and the text block hangs straight without any twist or skew. The structure is sound, and it has the clean, functional beauty of a thing made with care. Now you must secure the cord ends on the outer faces of the boards. You lay the book down on the bench, the first board facing upward, and you examine the 3 points where the cords emerge. Each cord stands slightly proud of the surface, a small tuft of twisted linen surrounded by a faint ring of paste that squeezed out during the lacing. You take a sharp knife, the same small blade you use for trimming thread, and you cut each cord off close to the wood, leaving only a tiny stub about the thickness of a fingernail protruding from the hole. The cut ends are fuzzy and uneven, and you dab them with a touch of fresh paste from the tip of your finger, working the paste into the fibers until they are soft and pliable again. Then you take a polished bone peg, a short cylinder of bone rounded at one end, and you position it over the first stub. With a light tap from the mallet, you drive the peg against the stub, forcing the cut end down into the hole and spreading the fibers outward against the walls of the hole. The mallet strikes with a gentle cushion sound, a brief wooden note that fades quickly. You tap a second time, a third, each blow lighter than the one before, until the cord end is flush with the surrounding wood and the hole is completely filled with a dense plug of linen and paste. The surface is smooth to the touch, and when you run your finger over it, you cannot feel the transition between wood and cord. You repeat this with the other 2 stubs on the first board, tapping each one down until it disappears into the yoke. And then you turn the book over and do the same on the second board. The pegging takes time, because each stub must be tapped slowly and carefully, with frequent checks to ensure that the cord is not being driven too deep, which would leave a depression, or too shallow, which would leave a bump. You use the mallet with a loose, relaxed grip, letting its weight do the work rather than your arm, and the sound of the tapping is soft and rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. When all 6 cord ends have been hammered flush, you wipe the outer faces of the boards with a barely damp cloth to remove any smears of paste, and then you buff them dry with a scrap of linen. The oak gleams faintly, the grain now interrupted only by the tiny darker circles where the cord ends have been sealed into the wood. You leave the book to rest for a while, the paste still drying within the channels and the pegged holes, and you turn your attention to cleaning the tools. The brush is rinsed in the basin. The bristles work gently between your fingers to remove the paste before it hardens, and then it is laid flat on the tile to dry. The bone folder is wiped with a dry cloth and returned to its groove on the bench. The mallet is dusted with a soft brush, its handle inspected for any cracks, and then set back on its hook. The paste pot is covered with a fresh piece of damp linen, and the spatula is cleaned and laid across the top. The bench itself is wiped down with a dry rag, catching the stray fibers of linen and the small flakes of dried paste that have accumulated during the work. The workshop, which was a place of active labor only moments ago, returns by degrees to its usual stillness. After a suitable pause, during which you drink a cup of water and look out the window at the grey, soft sky, you return to the book and test the joints once more. The paste has dried enough that the boards are firmly attached, and the hinges move smoothly without any crackling sound or resistance. You open each board fully, then close it, and the book responds with the solid, quiet authority of a well-made object. You pick the book up and hold it in both hands, feeling its weight, its balance, the way the boards sit parallel to one another and the text block hangs straight. It is a book now, a true book. Its skeleton of paper, thread, cord and wood all joined together into a single coherent body. The only things it lacks are its skin of leather and its metal clasps, and those will come in their own time. You set the book back on its felt pad and cover it loosely with the linen cloth that has protected it through all the earlier stages. The cloth is soft and worn, and it drapes over the boards with a gentle fall, hiding the oak and the cords from the light. You place a light weight on top, a smooth stone from the river that serves the same purpose here as it did when you were pressing the gatherings, and the book settles under its pressure with a faint creak, as if it is exhaling after a long day. The weight will hold the boards flat while the paste finishes drying, and it will prevent any warping that might be caused by the moisture still held in the wood and the cords. You sweep the floor one last time, the broom gathering the small debris of the morning, a few wood shavings you missed earlier, a scrap of paste that fell from the brush, a stray fiber of linen cord. The dustpan is emptied into the basket, and the broom is returned to its corner. You wash your hands thoroughly, using the block of coarse soap that rests in a dish by the basin, and you scrub the paste from under your fingernails and from the creases of your knuckles. The water in the basin clouds with a milky swirl, and then clears as you rinse. You dry your hands and apply a little oil to the tips of your fingers, where the skin has grown dry from handling the oak and the paste, and you work the oil in slowly, feeling the small cracks and rough patches soften under your touch. Your apron comes off, and you hang it on its peg. You stand in the doorway of the workshop, one hand on the frame, and you look back at the bench where the book rests under its linen cloth and its stone weight. The room is dim and quiet, the brazier ticking softly to itself, the shadows long and blue in the corners. The book does not look like much from here, just a cloth-covered shape on a bench, but you know what it contains: the gathered sheets, the sewn signatures, the rounded spine, the laced cords, the pegged holes, the patient oak. All of it is there, waiting under the cloth, and tomorrow you will cover it with calfskin and begin the slow work of tooling the leather. But that is tomorrow. For now, you step through the door, pull it gently shut, and walk into the cool air of the evening. The sounds of your footsteps echoing softly on the cobblestones as you leave the bindery to its silence. The alum-tawed calfskin that will cover the boards and spine has been waiting in the corner of the workshop, rolled loosely with the flesh side outward and tied with a strip of linen tape. You retrieve the roll from its shelf, feeling the slight give of the leather as you carry it to the bench, and untie the tape with a single pull that releases the coil. The skin opens across the bench like a pale landscape, its surface a soft, even white with the faintest yellowish bloom, similar to fresh cream that has been poured into a shallow dish. Alum tawing, the process that transformed this animal hide into a covering material, uses mineral salts rather than tannins, so the leather retains a light, almost papery color that will darken gently over the years into a warm honey tone. You run your palm over the skin and feel its cool, smooth surface, slightly sided on the flesh side and glossy on the grain side, the fibers tight and strong. The smell is clean and faintly mineral, with a whisper of the lime that was used in the early stages of preparation, a smell that is mellowed over the months it spent stacked in the workshop. You spread the skin flat and examine it for flaws. A good binding skin must be free of cuts, thin spots, or the raised lines of old scars, and this one is nearly perfect, except for a small area near one edge where the grain is slightly looser, a place you will trim away. You turn it grain side up, and the light from the high windows slides across its surface in a silvery sheen that shifts as you move your head. The shape of the skin is irregular, as animal skins always are, with a broad center and tapering ends where the legs and neck once were. Your task is to cut from this irregular shape a rectangle large enough to cover both boards, the spine, and leave a margin for the turn-ins, the flaps that will fold over the edges of the boards and glue down on the inner faces. You will use a template made of thin board, one you cut for this Bible size many bindings ago, and have used ever since, its edges softened by repeated handling. You lay the template on the grain side of the skin, centering it over the broadest part, and trace around it with a faint graphite line. The rectangle it marks out is generous, extending beyond the boards by about 2 finger widths on all sides, ample margin for the turn-ins. You pick up a semicircular leather knife, its blade a crescent of polished steel, with a sharp inner curve and a wooden handle that fits into the hollow of your palm. The knife is always kept sharp, and you test its edge with a light touch of your thumb before you begin. Then you position the blade at one corner of the traced line and push down with a firm, steady stroke, cutting the leather cleanly. The blade travels along the graphite line with a soft, crisp sound, a sound somewhere between a tear and a hiss, and the leather parts before it without resistance. You turn the skin as you work, keeping the blade angled slightly outward so that the cut edge is beveled rather than square, a bevel that will make the turn-ins lie flatter against the boards. When the last side is cut, you lift away the excess leather and set it aside. It will be saved for smaller bindings or for practicing tooling patterns. The covering rectangle now lies on the bench, its edges neat and true, ready for the paste. Before you apply the paste, you must prepare the text block and its boards for the covering. The block has been resting in the lying press since you laced the cords and trimmed them flush, and you lift it out now, cradling it with both hands. The boards move freely on their cord hinges, but the fit is snug, and the rounded spine stands proud between the two wooden covers. You open each board in turn and check that the inner surfaces are clean and free of any dried paste from the lacing. You wipe them with a dry cloth, removing a few specks of dust, and then you set the book down on a clean sheet of waste paper. Next, you take a piece of linen cord, about a handspan long, and tie it loosely around the middle of the text block to hold the gatherings together during the covering. When the paste has dried and the leather has set, you will remove it, but for now it keeps the spine from shifting. You also insert a slip of waxed paper between the first and last gatherings and their adjacent boards, a barrier that will keep the turn-ins from sticking prematurely to the paper. These small preparations take only a few minutes, but they are the difference between a smooth covering and one full of small frustrations. Now you turn your attention to the paste. The paste pot on the brazier has been warming all morning, and when you lift the lid and stir it with a bone spatula, it moves thickly, a smooth white mass with a consistency of soft porridge. You test a drop between your thumb and forefinger, pressing them together and then apart, and the paste forms a fine, tacky thread that holds for a moment before breaking. It is just right. You transfer a generous dollop to a shallow dish on the bench and let it cool slightly while you lay out the tools you will need. A wide paste brush with soft hob bristles, a bone folder polished to a high gleam, a clean sponge, a bowl of water, and a stack of soft linen cloths. The sponge is a new one, cut from a larger piece that came from the sea, and it has a springy, open texture that holds water well. You turn the leather rectangle grain side down on the bench, the flesh side exposed, a surface that is matte and slightly rough to the touch. Dip the paste brush into the dish and work the bristles in a circular motion to load them evenly. Then begin to spread the paste across the leather with long, sweeping strokes that start at the center and move outward in all directions. The paste is cool and smooth, and it glides over the flesh side with a soft, wet sound, like a gentle rain on still water. The leather darkens as it absorbs the moisture, its pale ivory shifting to a deeper, more translucent tone that allows the grain pattern to show through more clearly. You work the paste into every part of the skin, paying extra attention to the edges where the turn-ins will fold, because a dry edge will not flex properly and may crack. When the whole surface is evenly coated, you let the skin rest for a few minutes, allowing the paste to penetrate the fibers, and you brush a second lighter coat over the first to ensure a strong bond. The skin has now become quite pliable, its stiffness melting away under the influence of the moisture. It drapes over your hand with a limp, heavy feel, and a smell of the warm paste has softened its mineral scent into something richer and earthier. While the paste works into the leather, you turn to the text block and brush a very thin coating of paste along the spine and the outer faces of the boards. This is a light, quick application, just enough paste to give the leather something to grip, and you wipe away any excess with a barely damp sponge. The boards darken slightly where the paste touches them, the oak grain becoming more pronounced, and the spine grows tacky, its paper surface glistening in the low light. You set the book down with the boards open, resting on the bench, and reach for the pasted skin. The moment of bringing the leather to the book is the quietest moment of the covering, a pause in which you gather your attention and align everything in your mind. You lift the skin carefully, holding it by the head and tail edges so that your fingers do not disturb the fresh paste, and you position it over the book with the grain side outward. The spine of the book is the first part to make contact. You lower the skin onto the rounded spine, centering it so that the head and tail margins are equal, and press it down lightly with your fingertips, following the curve of the back. The leather clings immediately, the paste creating a soft suction that holds it in place, and you smooth it over the spine with your palms, molding it around the raised bands where the three cords stand out. The skin stretches slightly as you work it, a natural give that allows it to conform to the shape of the spine without wrinkling. Then you lift one side of the skin and drape it over the first board. You work from the spine outward, pressing the leather onto the wood with a slow sweeping motion of your hand, smoothing it from the joint toward the foredge. The leather touches down with a soft, wet adherence, and you guide it outward with care so that no bubbles of air are trapped beneath. When the board is covered, you repeat the motion on the second board, drawing the leather tight but not stretching it beyond its natural capacity. The book now lies before you, wrapped in its pale skin, the boards and spine all covered, the turn-ins extending beyond the edges on all sides like an overhang of pale cloth. The skin has a liquid sheen from the paste, and it clings to the contours of the book with a perfect closeness, the raised bands visible as gentle ridges across the spine. You pause in your smoothing to examine the book from all angles, turning it over and checking that the grain runs straight, that the leather is centered, that no crease or wrinkle has formed. Everything is as it should be. You pick up the bone folder, its tip rounded and smooth, and begin to work the leather more firmly, using the flat side of the folder to press it into the joints and around the bands. The folder slides over the damp skin with a faint rubbing sound, and the slight warmth of the tool helps the leather to conform to the shape beneath. You run the folder along the hinge line between the spine and the boards, pressing the leather into the shallow groove of the joint until it lies snug against the cords. Then you draw it across the spine bands, defining their edges so that they stand out clearly from the panels between them. The bone leaves a faint, burnished trail on the damp leather, a temporary mark that will fade as the paste dries, but the shape it creates will remain. Now you turn your attention to the turn-ins. You lift the book and hold it with the foredge facing upward, and you begin to fold the overhanging leather over the edge of the first board. The leather is soft and cooperative from the paste, and it bends over the wood with a gentle, curving ease. You mold it with your thumbs, working from the center toward the corners, pressing it down onto the inner face of the board. The corners are always the most delicate part of the covering. Excess leather gathers there, and if folded carelessly, it will form a thick, clumsy lump that will spoil the neatness of the binding. You take the corner between your thumb and forefinger and pinch the leather into a small pleat, then fold it over at a 45-degree angle to create a neat mitre. The fold must be sharp enough to lie flat, but not so sharp that the leather is cut by its own tension. You work each corner slowly, adjusting the fold until the mitre sits perfectly, a tiny envelope of leather that will protect the most vulnerable part of the board. Once all four corners of the first board are mitred, you smooth the turn-ins flat with the bone folder, pressing firmly along the inner edge, and then repeat the entire process on the second board. The turn-ins now cover the inner perimeter of each board, leaving a central rectangle of bare wood that will later be hidden by the paster downs, the heavy paper sheets that will be glued over them. You examine the outer surfaces one last time, checking for any small wrinkle or spot where the leather has not adhered. A tiny bubble near the foredge of the backboard catches your eye, and you work it out with the tip of the folder, smoothing it toward the edge until it vanishes. The leather is smooth and even, its color a uniform pale ivory, and the spine bands stand in neat, parallel relief. You set the covered book aside on a clean sheet of waste paper to dry, its boards closed, and you place a light weight, the same smooth river stone you use for pressing gatherings on top, to keep the boards from warping as the paste sets. The paste will take many hours to dry fully, and during that time the leather will shrink slightly, pulling itself even tighter around the boards and spine, conforming to the shape of the book with a grip that will last for centuries. You clean the bench of the clasps from the covering. The paste dish is wiped and set aside. The brush is rinsed in warm water and hung to dry. The sponge is squeezed out and left to air, and the bone folder is polished with a dry cloth. The offcuts of leather are rolled back into their bundle and tied, and the template is returned to its place on the shelf. You wash your hands in the basin, scrubbing the sticky residue of paste from your fingers until the water runs clear, and you dry them on your apron. The book will need time to dry before you can proceed to the tooling, and you use this interval to prepare the finishing tools. On a low shelf near the brazier, you keep a set of brass finishing tools, each one a small block of metal mounted on a wooden handle, their faces engraved with simple patterns. You select a few for this binding, a straight-line fillet for drawing the border, a small wheel with a continuous pattern of dots, and a fleuron stamp shaped like a four-petaled flower. You lay these on the bench and examine their faces, which are clean but slightly tarnished from disuse. You polish them with a soft cloth and a pinch of fine ash until the brass gleams, and then you set them on a warming plate above the brazier to heat gently. The warmth will help the tools impress the leather more deeply, darkening the lines without the need for gold. This is blind tooling, the simplest and oldest way to decorate a binding, and its quiet beauty relies on the contrast between the impressed lines and the natural surface of the leather. After an hour or two, You test the dryness of the leather by touching a hidden spot near the tail with a dry fingertip. The surface is cool and no longer tacky, though the deeper layers will still be drying for some time. The paste has set enough for tooling, and you bring the covered book back to the bench, removing the stone weight and opening it briefly to check that the turn-ins are secure. They are firm and flat, the corners tight, the spine bands crisp. You close the book and lay it flat on the bench, the front board facing upward. You take the warm fillet from the plate, its handle wrapped in a scrap of linen to protect your hand from the heat, and you test its temperature by holding it near your cheek. It is warm but not hot, just enough heat to make the leather yield without scorching. You position the fillet about a thumb width from the edge of the board, aligning it with the foredge, and press it down into the leather with a firm, steady pressure. The brass sinks into the skin, leaving a dark, linear impression that captures the light in its depths. You continue the line along the foredge, then turn the book and do the top edge, the tail edge, and finally the spine edge, creating a ruled border that frames the entire board. The lines are straight and even, their darkness a uniform charcoal grey against the pale ivory of the skin, and where they meet at the corners, they overlap just slightly to form neat junctions. You repeat the border on the backboard, then add a second inner line parallel to the first, creating a double frame that gives the binding a quiet, balanced elegance. With the borders complete, you pick up the fluoron stamp. Its face is small, no wider than the tip of your thumb, engraved with the simple outline of a four-petaled flower inside a diamond. You position it at the center of each panel on the spine, pressing it down with a slight rocking motion to ensure an even impression, and then at the four outer corners of each board where the lines of the border meet. The fluoron impressions are delicate and precise, their fine lines dark and sharp against the smooth leather. You add a few touches with the dotting wheel, running it along the spine bands to create a subtle texture that will catch the light when the book is on a shelf. The work is slow but satisfying, each mark a small commitment of brass to leather, permanent and quiet. When the tooling is finished, you set the warm tools aside to cool on their rack and step back to look at the covered book. The binding is pale and simple, its decoration understated, the kind of binding that will age gracefully as the leather darkens and the blind tooling mellows into the patina of centuries. You run your thumb over one of the lines and feel the slight groove it has left, a texture that will remain long after you are gone. The book lies closed on the bench, its boards even, its spine rounded, its clasps not yet attached, but already the volume has the presence of a finished thing. You drape a light cloth over it to protect it from the dust, and you begin to tidy the workshop for the evening. The brazier is banked, the tools cleaned, the floor swept, and at last you hang your apron on its peg and stand in the doorway, looking back at the quiet room. The covered book rests under its cloth, patient and still, waiting for the brass clasps that will be the final touch. The final morning arrives with a soft grey light that fills the bindery like water filling a basin, slow and even and without shadow. You have been waiting for this day, the day when the last small pieces of brass are attached to the boards and the book becomes fully itself, complete in every particular. The covered volume rests on the bench under its linen cloth, the leather now fully dry and tight across the spine and boards. The blind-tooled lines a quiet geometry of darker lines against the pale ivory surface. You remove the cloth, fold it, and set it aside, and for a moment you simply look at the book. It has travelled a long road from the stacks of printed sheets that arrived in the workshop months ago, and now it lacks only the clasps that will hold its heavy covers closed and keep the pages pressed flat. You open a small velvet-lined box that sits on the corner of the bench, its wooden sides worn smooth by the passage of many hands. Inside, resting in individual compartments, are the brass clasps you will use. Each clasp consists of two parts, a hinge plate that will be nailed to the foredge of the backboard and a curved hook that will reach across the foredge to catch a pin set into the front board. The brass has a dull golden gleam, its surface slightly mottled from the casting, with tiny pits and flow lines that speak of the foundry where it was poured. You lift one hinge plate and turn it over in your hand. It is a simple rectangle of brass, no wider than your thumb and about twice as long, with a rounded end where the hinge will pivot and a series of small nail holes along its length. The curved hook, likewise, is a simple crescent of metal with a small loop at one end that will engage the hinge pin. You lay the pieces out on a square of felt, counting them, 2 hinge plates, 2 hooks, 2 catch pins for the front board, and a small collection of tiny iron nails with flat square heads. Everything is here, and everything is clean. You begin with the backboard, which will receive the hinge plates. You open the book gently, the leather joints flexing with a soft, silent ease, and you lay the backboard flat on the bench with the foredge facing toward you. The positions for the clasps are a matter of proportion. They will sit 1/3 of the way up from the tail and 1/3 of the way down from the head, dividing the foredge into 3 roughly equal sections. You measure this with a strip of paper, folding it to mark the distances, and then transfer the marks to the board with a light graphite dot. You place the first hinge plate on the board, aligning its inner edge with the foredge and centering it over the mark, and you trace around it with a sharp graphite point, leaving a faint outline that will guide your drilling. Then you repeat the process for the second hinge plate at the upper mark. With the positions marked, you take up a fine awl, its steel point sharp and slender, and you press it into the first nail hole on the outline of the first hinge plate. The awl pierces the leather with a small, crisp pop and enters the oak beneath. You turn the awl slowly, working it down into the wood to create a pilot hole that will guide the iron nail and prevent the wood from splitting. The brass plate is not thick, and the nails are tiny, so the holes need not be deep. A few turns of the awl are enough to seat the point. You work your way around the hinge plate, piercing each nail hole in turn, and then do the same for the second plate. The leather resists slightly, but the awl is sharp and your hand is steady, and the holes appear as a neat constellation of tiny punctures on the board. Now you take the first hinge plate and set it in place over its holes, aligning it carefully with the graphite outline. You select an iron nail from the box, a sliver of metal, no longer than a grain of barley, with a square head and a tapered shank. You set the nail into the first hole and tap it lightly with a small hammer, the same light mallet you use for pegging cords, but wielded with even more delicacy. The nail sinks into the pilot hole with a faint, metallic tick, and you tap it down until the head sits flush against the brass. You move to the next hole, then the next, working around the plate in a slow circle, each tap a precise tiny note in the quiet of the workshop. When the hinge plate is fully nailed, you test it with a gentle push. It is solid, immobile, its surface flat, and its edges flush with the leather. You repeat the nailing with the second hinge plate, and then you rest the hammer on the bench and flex your fingers, which have grown slightly tense from the small, careful motions. Next, you must attach the catch pins to the front board. These pins are short posts of brass, each with a small rounded head and a shank that tapers to a point. They will be driven into the front board at the exact positions opposite the hinge plates so that the hooks can reach across the foredge and grip them. You close the book and hold it firmly, then bring the first hook across from the hinge plate to touch the front board, marking the spot where the hook's curve naturally falls. You open the book again and make a small mark on the front board at that spot, then use the awl to start a hole. The pilot hole for a catch pin must be angled slightly inward toward the center of the board, so the pin will resist the outward pull of the hook. You set the awl at a slight slant and work it in slowly, testing the depth with the pin itself until the shank will seat securely. Then you dip the tip of the pin in a tiny amount of paste, just enough to lubricate it, and press it into the hole with your fingers. When it is started, you take a small wooden drift, a cylinder of hardwood the size of a pencil, and place it against the head of the pin. A few light taps with a hammer drive the pin home, its head standing a little above the leather, a small brass dome that will catch the hook. You repeat this on the other mark, setting the second catch pin at the same angle, and then you buff both pins with a scrap of linen to remove any smudge of paste. Now the moment comes to fit the hooks. Each hook is a small brass crescent, its inner curve smooth and its outer curve slightly ridged, with a loop at one end that will slip over a pin on the hinge plate. You slide the loop of the first hook onto the hinge pin, working it gently until it pivots freely, and then you swing the hook across the foredge toward the front board. The hook meets the catch pin with a soft metallic scrape, and you adjust the curvature slightly by bending it with a pair of small pliers, a tool whose jaws are wrapped in leather so that the brass is not marred. You bend the hook a fraction, test it, bend again, until the hook snaps over the catch pin with a firm, satisfying click. The clasp holds the boards closed with a gentle tension, not so tight that the book strains to open, but enough to keep the heavy pages from fanning. You repeat the adjustment on the second hook, and when both clasps are working, you open and close them several times, listening to the soft click and feeling the smooth action of the hinge. With both clasps fitted and functioning, you turn your attention to the final cleaning and burnishing of the binding. You take a soft woolen cloth, well worn and slightly greasy from years of use, and you apply a whisper of beeswax to its surface, no more than a dab that leaves a faint sheen on the fibers. You rub this cloth over the entire surface of the leather, working in small circles that spread the wax into a microscopic film. The leather responds immediately, its pale ivory darkening just a shade and taking on a quiet luster that is not shiny but matte and warm, like the skin of a hazelnut. You buff the leather slowly, covering every inch of both boards and the spine and the turn-ins, until the whole binding glows with a soft, even light. Then you polish the brass clasps with a clean corner of the cloth, removing any tarnish from the hinges and hooks, and the metal gleams with a gentle golden hue. After the buffing, you open the book one final time to check the inner surfaces. The turn-ins are still flat and secure, the corners tight, the paste having dried to a hard, translucent film. The text block opens smoothly, the rounded spine arching into a gentle curve that allows the pages to lie flat, and the first gathering of the Great Bible reveals its columns of black-letter type, the ink still sharp after years of waiting. You close the book and fasten the clasps, hearing the two small clicks in succession, and then you set the volume upright on the bench, its spine facing you. The three raised bands stand in quiet relief under the leather. The blind-tooled lines frame the boards with simple dignity, and the brass catches glint softly in the grey light from the windows. You step back and let your hands rest at your sides. The bindery is completely silent, the brazier having been extinguished the evening before, the glue pot cold and clean on its shelf. The tools you used for this binding, the bone folder, the sewing needle, the mallet, the chisel, the gimlet, the backing hammer, and all the rest have been wiped and put away in their places. The floor has been swept, the bench wiped down, the scraps of leather and paper cleared. The only thing that remains out of place is the book itself, which now sits on the bench as if it has always been there, as if it has grown from the wood of the worktop like a slow, deliberate fruit. You pick up the heavy volume in both hands and carry it to the finishing shelf, a long oaken shelf near the door where completed bindings wait to be collected. There are a few other books already there, smaller volumes bound for different patrons, but the Bible dominates the shelf by its sheer size, its pale leather standing out among the darker bindings. You slide it into place and pat its spine lightly, a small gesture of farewell. The book is no longer yours. It belongs to whoever will open it next, perhaps a scholar in a distant monastery or a priest in a cathedral library, someone who will read the words without ever thinking of the hands that gathered the sheets and sewed the gatherings and shaped the spine and covered the boards. That anonymity is the bookbinder's gift, and you give it freely. You walk to the stone basin and wash your hands a final time, scrubbing away the last traces of wax and brass and leather. The water runs cool over your skin, and you cup your hands and splash your face, letting the water run down your cheeks and drip into the basin. You dry your face and hands on the rough linen towel, and then you remove your apron for the last time on this binding, hanging it on its peg with a familiar, final motion. The apron swings gently and then settles. It stains a map of all the work that has passed through this workshop. You stand in the open doorway and look back into the bindery. The light through the high windows has begun its slow retreat, the grey of the morning giving way to the softer gold of late afternoon. The shadows have lengthened across the floor, and the dust mote starts lazily in the shafts of light. The workshop is peaceful, its tools at rest, its shelves holding the materials for the next book and the book after that. The finished Bible rests on the finishing shelf, a quiet monument to the hours of patient labor that shaped it. You breathe in the smell of the room paper, oak, leather, paste, beeswax, brass, and then you step outside, pulling the door gently closed behind you. The latch falls with a soft click, and the bindery sinks into its evening stillness, holding the new book in its quiet embrace as the world outside goes on its way.